The hall was full of the wrong kind of quiet. Not the quiet that comes before a prayer, or the quiet of a room waiting for music to begin. This was the quiet that happens when 200 people stop breathing at the same time, because something has gone sideways and nobody knows what to do next. Lyra Ashvale knew exactly what to do. She was going to walk out. She pulled her bag strap higher on her shoulder, tucked her map case under her arm, and turned away from King Caden Voss, ruler of the Northern, Eastern, and Central Territories, absolute authority over every pack within 1,000 miles, and she walked toward the door. Behind her, not a single person moved. She had made it 7 steps before she heard him, not shouting, not commanding. His voice came out low and almost amused, the way a man speaks when he has just been handed a puzzle he did not expect. She said no, Caden said, to no one in particular. Lyra did not stop walking. She actually said no. She pushed open the heavy oak door of the Territorial Summit Hall and stepped into the gray afternoon light, and the door swung shut behind her, with a sound like a full stop at the end of a very long sentence. The summit had been running for 3 days. Lyra had not wanted to be there for any of them. She had been hired, modestly, precisely, without ceremony, by the summit's organizing committee to produce updated border maps for the new territorial agreements being negotiated inside that hall. Her job was to sit at a corner desk, correct the old cartography errors that had been causing land disputes for 40 years, and leave. She was very good at that job. She had been doing it since she was 19, learning at her father's side, taking over his routes when his hands stopped being steady enough to hold a pen. She was 26 now, and she had mapped more unclaimed land than any official cartographer in the territory, largely because she was willing to go places official cartographers refused to. She had not been hired to be anybody's fated mate. The thing about fated bonds, the thing that people who had never experienced one like to describe in glowing terms, in stories, in songs, in the kind of breathless way that suggested they had never actually watched what happened to a person once the bond took hold, was that they arrived without asking. One moment you were a person with your own direction and your own plans. The next moment there was a pull, a tug deep in the chest, like a hook attached to something you could not see. And if you followed that hook, if you let it lead you, you would spend the rest of your life organized around someone else's gravity. Lyra's mother had followed her hook. Lyra had watched what that looked like from the inside. She was not following anything. She walked across the stone courtyard of the summit complex and found the low wall where she had eaten her lunch every afternoon for 3 days, away from the noise, facing the hills to the east where the border trees were just visible on the horizon. She sat down. She set her map case beside her. She opened her bag and found the small tin of dried apricots she carried everywhere, because sometimes you needed something simple and reliable, and she ate one. Inside the hall she could hear, very faintly, through 3 inches of oak and stone, the sound of 200 people beginning to talk all at once. She ate another apricot. She had felt it the moment he walked into the hall on the first morning. She would not pretend otherwise to herself, because she was not in the habit of lying to herself. It was the pull. It was unmistakable. It hit her in the sternum like a quiet fist, and she had looked up from her desk in the corner and found him already looking at her from across the room, which meant he had felt it too, which meant that someone up in whatever passes for the governing authority of the universe had made a genuinely poor decision. She had looked back down at her maps. She had spent 2 days not looking up whenever he entered the room. She had spent 2 days being extremely focused on the border of the Ridgeback Valley, which had been incorrectly drawn since the 1890s, and needed about 40 hours of careful correction. She was good at being focused. She had trained herself to be focused the way other people train themselves to run long distances, by doing it until it became the default, until the effort was invisible. But this morning, Governor Ashton had called all parties to the floor for a formal recognition, a procedural thing, everyone introducing themselves, a tradition the summit maintained to ensure that everyone in the room knew who everyone else was before the real negotiating began. And Lyra had stood with her map case and given her name and her role, and Caden had been standing 6 feet away, and the pull had done what the pull does, and he had looked at her with the kind of directness that most people spend their whole lives trying to achieve. He had asked to speak to her privately. She had said, in front of Governor Ashton and 200 delegates and the 7 members of the territorial press who were covering the summit, that she appreciated the request, but she was not available for private conversations with anyone while the summit was in session, as she was there in a professional capacity. He had looked at her for a long moment with those dark eyes that gave nothing away and everything away simultaneously, and he had said, quietly, "I think you know this isn't a professional matter." And she had said, just as quietly, so that only he and the 6 people nearest to them could hear, I know exactly what this is. My answer is no. And that was the moment when 200 people stopped breathing. She sat on the wall and looked at the hills and ate her apricots, and she tried to decide whether she felt good about what she had done or just relieved, and found that the answer was both, and underneath both was something she refused to name. The door to the hall opened. She did not look up. Footsteps crossed the courtyard, deliberate, unhurried, the steps of someone who had nowhere else they needed to be. They stopped a few feet away from her. "You can sit somewhere else," she said. "There's a whole courtyard." "There is," said Caden Voss. He did not sit somewhere else. He stood at a comfortable distance, far enough to be respectful, close enough that she could not pretend she had not noticed him, and he looked at the hills. She ate another apricot and did not look at him. "I'm not here to argue with you," he said. "Good. I just wanted to apologize for putting you in that position, in front of everyone." He paused. "That wasn't fair to you. I should have found a better moment." That was not what she had expected him to say. She had expected pressure, or persuasion, or the particular kind of gentle insistence that powerful men use when they want something and are trying to be civilized about it. She had not expected an apology. She looked at him. He was looking at the hills. He was tall, very tall, with the kind of build that came from years of real work, not performance. His hair was dark and slightly too long for someone who was supposed to be attending formal diplomatic functions, and his face was the kind of face that cartographers would describe as having strong, defining features, which was a professional way of saying it was the sort of face that was difficult to stop looking at once you started. She looked back at the hills. "Apology noted," she said. "Thank you." He put his hands in his coat pockets. "What are the apricots for?" "Eating." "Right." A pause. "Are they good?" "They are dried apricots. They are what they are." He almost smiled. She could see it at the edge of her vision, the small shift at the corner of his mouth, the way his shoulders settled slightly. "Fair enough," he said. She closed the tin. She looked at him properly this time because she had decided that pretending he was not there was a strategy that had already failed twice and would go on failing, and she was not interested in failed strategies. "I know what you want," she said. "I understand what the bond feels like. I'm not pretending it isn't there. I'm telling you that I have made a decision about my own life, and it does not include following a bond anywhere, with anyone. That is not a negotiating position. It is not something I said because I was caught off guard in a public room. It is the answer." He looked at her. His expression was steady, careful, the way a person looks when they are actually listening rather than just waiting for their turn to speak. "I understand," he said. "Do you?" "Yes," he said. "I'm not going to pretend I'm not." He stopped. He tried again. "I felt it too. I'm not going to pretend I did not, but your life is yours, and your decisions are yours, and nothing about a bond changes that." He looked back at the hills. "I just wanted you to know that I'm not going to make this difficult for you. The summit runs for 4 more days. You have a job to do. I'll stay out of your way." Lyra looked at him for a long moment. She had met alphas before. She had met them in border negotiations and land surveys and the quiet, tense moments when she showed up to map a corridor that 2 packs both claimed. She knew what they looked like when they were performing reasonableness. She knew the difference between a man who was saying the right thing and a man who meant it. She could not entirely tell which one this was. "Thank you," she said, because it was the honest response. He nodded. He turned to go. "Caden," she said, before she had entirely decided to say it. He stopped. "What were you expecting?" she asked, "when you walked in this morning?" He considered the question. She watched him consider it. He was not a man who gave quick answers to serious things, she noticed. He took the question seriously and turned it over before he replied. "I wasn't expecting anything," he said. "I felt the pull 3 days ago. I've been deciding what to do about it." He paused. "I suppose I thought I should say something rather than nothing. I don't know what I was expecting." "That's honest," she said. "I try to be." She looked at him for one more moment, then she looked back at the hills. 4 more days, she said. 4 more days, he agreed, and walked back toward the hall. She sat on the wall for a long time after he left, long enough for the afternoon to start turning its colors toward evening, long enough for the distant border trees to go from green to gray-green to almost black against the sky. She was thinking about the pull in her chest, which had not gone away. She was thinking about the way he had said "I try to be," which was different from saying "I am." She was thinking about her mother's hands. She was not going to follow the hook. But she opened her tin of apricots and found she had eaten more of them than she realized, and she sat there in the cooling air and admitted to herself, quietly, the way she admitted things that she was not going to do anything about. that the man had surprised her. She did not like being surprised. She did not dislike it as much as she thought she would. Inside the hall, she could hear the delegates finally settling, the low tide of voices pulling back toward something organized, the sound of chairs being moved and papers being shuffled. In an hour there would be a formal dinner. She was not required to attend it. She had a map correction to finish. The eastern ridge boundary that had been cutting 3 families off from their water source for a generation. And she was going to finish it tonight, while the delegates ate their dinner and toasted their alliances and argued about language in the agreements. She put the tin away and picked up her map case. 4 more days. She was going to do her job and she was going to leave, and whatever the universe had decided about fated bonds was going to have to work itself out without her cooperation. She walked back toward the wing of the complex where she had been given a small workroom, and she did not look over her shoulder, and the pull in her chest moved with her like a compass needle that had found north and was never going to stop pointing there, regardless of what she wanted. She was used to inconvenience. She opened the door to her workroom and spread the Eastern Ridge map across the table and picked up her pen and got back to work. That night, at the formal dinner she was not attending, 200 delegates and their staff and the 7 members of the territorial press all had one thing to talk about. One person in that hall was conspicuously absent, and at the head table, King Caden Voss ate his dinner and answered his questions and talked about the boundary agreements with the calm, measured attention he brought to everything, and if anyone noticed that he smiled once, quietly, at nothing in particular, between the first and second course, they did not remark on it. His beta noticed. Ren Calloway, sitting 2 seats down and watching his king with the dedicated professional attention of a man who had spent 11 years learning to read that face for the things it was not saying, picked up his wine glass and thought, well? He did not know what else to think. He went back to his dinner. In her workroom, Lyra corrected the Eastern Ridge boundary, and the pen moved steadily across the paper, and outside the window the night was clear and cold, and she did not think about the pull in her chest. She thought about the maps. She was always better when she thought about the maps. The Eastern Ridge boundary took her until past midnight. It was not a simple correction. The original survey had been done by a man named Cartwright in 1887, and Cartwright had made the particular error that surveyors make when they are working in bad weather and good faith. He had recorded the position of a seasonal stream as though it were a permanent one. The stream moved. Over the past 130 years, every border agreement in the Eastern Ridge region had been built on top of that one original mistake. Each new agreement assuming the previous one was correct, the error compounding quietly, like interest. Lyra had found the original Cartwright notes in the Territorial Archive 3 months ago, tucked into a folder that had not been opened since 1923. She had seen immediately what the problem was. She had spent 6 weeks cross-referencing old land records, family histories, and the physical geography of the ridge as it actually existed now, and she had produced a corrected survey that showed where the boundaries should have been all along. 3 families, the Greens, the Owens, and the Whitfields, had been cut off from the water source that their great-grandparents had relied on, not because of any decision anyone had made, but because of a bad day's weather in 1887 and a stream that moved. She was going to fix it. She worked with the careful, particular focus that was her best quality, the thing her father had seen in her when she was 11 years old, and had given her her first proper pen, and sat her down in front of a blank sheet of paper and said, "The job is to show what is actually there, not what someone thought was there, not what would be convenient for it to be. The job is to look clearly and draw what you see." She had never forgotten that. She finished the correction at 20 past midnight. She checked it 3 times. She rolled the new map carefully, tied it with the red thread she used for completed work, and set it in the delivery tray that the summit committee would check in the morning. She washed her hands. She looked out the window at the dark courtyard. The lamp in the east wing was still on. She did not know whose room was in the east wing. She did not think about it. She went to bed. She dreamed, briefly and without great drama, about hills and compass needles and a voice saying, "I try to be," in the quiet, steady way of someone who was choosing their words carefully, because the words mattered to them. She woke at 6. She was back at her desk by past. The summit had 3 more days to run, and she had 8 more maps to correct, and she was going to do her job, and then she was going to leave. She picked up her pen. Outside, in the pale morning light of the courtyard, she heard, without meaning to hear it, the sound of footsteps on the stone. She recognized them without looking up. She had not known she had already learned them. She kept her eyes on the map. The footsteps paused at a point that she calculated, without looking, was approximately 20 feet from her window. Then they moved on. She breathed out slowly through her nose. 8 maps. She drew the first line. Ren Calloway had a system. He had kept it for 11 years and it had never failed him. The system was simple. Watch the king's hands. Not his face. Caden had the kind of face that could hold a perfectly neutral expression while a building fell down behind him, and trying to read it was a fool's errand. But the hands were honest. When Caden was bored, his left thumb moved in a slow circle against his index finger. When he was angry, his hands went very still, which was worse than any visible tension. When he was thinking through a real problem, the kind that did not have a clean answer, his right hand would come up and rest against his jaw, not rubbing, just resting, like he was checking whether his own face was still there. The morning after the rejection, Caden's right hand barely left his jaw. They were in the summit's side chamber, a long, narrow room used for bilateral meetings, currently occupied by Caden and Ren, and 3 members of Caden's administrative staff, who were reviewing the draft language of the water rights agreement. The agreement was important. It was, arguably, the most consequential piece of work this summit would produce. Ren had spent 3 months preparing for it. Caden was supposed to be reviewing the 3rd clause. He was staring out the window. Ren passed him the document. Caden took it. His eyes moved across the page in a way that looked like reading. Ren was not entirely convinced that reading was what was happening. The 3rd clause, Ren said. I see it. You've been on it for 9 minutes. Caden looked up from the document. He looked at Ren with an expression of mild patience, the kind that suggested he had noticed the comment and was choosing, consciously, not to be annoyed by it. It's fine, he said. The language is clear. The language has an ambiguity in the 2nd sentence. If you read adjacent as referring to the waterway rather than the land parcel, the entire southern clause becomes unenforceable. Caden looked back at the page. This time his eyes actually moved at the speed of reading. Ren watched him find it. You're right, Caden said. Flag it. Ren flagged it. He handed the document to the nearest staff member and waited until the 3 of them had found reasons to be briefly interested in the far end of the table, and then he turned back to Caden and said, quietly, How are you doing? Caden gave him a look. I'm asking as a professional, Ren said. We have 2 more bilateral sessions this afternoon and a full-floor negotiation tomorrow morning. I need to know if you're going to be present for them. I'm present. You were on the 3rd clause for 9 minutes. I found an ambiguity. I found the ambiguity. You were looking out the window. Ren kept his voice level and careful, because he had known this man for 11 years, and he knew exactly how much he could push, and exactly where the line was. She said no. I understand that's significant. I'm not pretending it isn't. But we have work to do. Caden was quiet for a moment. He set the document down on the table and straightened it with one hand, a precise, controlled motion. Then he said, I know we have work to do. Good? I'm not spiraling, Ren. I'm thinking. About the water rights agreement? No. Ren nodded slowly. He pulled his chair out slightly and sat back in it, settling in for a longer conversation than he had originally planned. She really said no, he said. It came out less like a question and more like a fact he was still in the process of absorbing. Yes, in front of everyone. Yes, and you. Ren stopped. He tried again. And you smiled. Caden looked at him. There was something in his expression that Ren did not have a word for. Something between wry and genuinely moved, like a man who had been handed something he did not expect and was still deciding what it was. She wasn't rattled, he said. She turned her back on you in front of 200 people. She did it calmly, without drama. She just decided, and then did it. He paused. I don't think anyone has ever just decided about me before. Ren processed this. He was a careful man, Ren. Methodical, precise, the kind of person who liked things to have clean edges. He did not particularly like what he was hearing, not because he begrudged his king anything, but because he could see the shape of where this might go, and the shape worried him. She's a cartographer, he said. I know. She has no pack affiliation. I know. Which means she has no political obligation to participate in whatever this is. I know that too, Ren. And she said no. Are you going to keep repeating that? I'm establishing the facts. Ren straightened his own documents, a habit he had when he was uncomfortable. What are you going to do? Caden was quiet for long enough that Ren thought he might not answer. Then he said, nothing. For now. She's here to do a job. I told her I'd stay out of her way. Ren blinked. You told her that? Yes. When? She left the hall, I assumed. I found her outside. I apologized for making it public. He paused. I should have found a better moment. It wasn't fair to her. Ren looked at his king for a long time. In 11 years, he had never heard Caden Voss say those words about a public interaction. He had never heard him apologize for strategy. Caden was not a cruel man. He was, genuinely, one of the least cruel, powerful men that Wren had ever worked with. But he was decisive, and he was direct, and he did not, as a rule, second-guess the moment of his decisions. "She said something to you," Wren said. Caden looked at him. "When you apologized, she said something that mattered to you. She said her answer wasn't a negotiating position." Wren considered that. "Was it?" "No," Caden said. "It wasn't." He picked up the water rights document again. "Let's get back to work." They got back to work. But Wren spent the next 3 hours watching, with professional attention and personal unease, the way Caden tracked the cartographer's position in whatever room they shared, without appearing to track it at all. At the midday recess, when delegates moved through the main hall in loose clusters, Wren watched Caden stay deep in conversation with the governor of the Southern Territory, a conversation that required genuine attention, about something genuinely complicated, and also, without any visible break in that conversation, orient himself so that he had a clear sightline to the far corner where Lyra Ashvale sat eating her lunch over a spread of maps. She did not look up. He did not stop talking about the Southern Territory's water concerns. Wren went and got himself a plate of food and stood near the window and tried to decide what he thought about all of this. He thought several things, and none of them were entirely comfortable. The first was that fated bonds were real, and they were powerful, and they did not care about anyone's schedule or political calendar. He had seen bonds disrupt things before, had seen them pull people sideways out of lives they had carefully built, had seen the confusion and the joy and the occasional genuine wreckage. He had always been glad not to have experienced one himself. He was glad of it now more than ever. The second was that Caden was not, despite what the morning might have suggested, losing his focus in any dangerous way. The water rights document had gotten its full attention after the first 9 minutes. The bilateral meetings in the afternoon had been sharp and productive. Whatever was happening in his king's interior life, it was not yet interfering with his capacity to function. The third was the thing that bothered Wren the most, and it was this: Caden was pleased. Not pleased in a superficial way. Not pleased in the way of a man who had received good news or won an argument. Pleased in a deeper, quieter way, the way a person looks when something they had almost stopped expecting has turned out to exist after all. Wren did not know what to do with that. He finished his lunch. He watched Lyra roll up one of her maps, tie it with red thread, and set it in the collection tray at the edge of the room. He watched her pull another map from her case and spread it on the table, and pick up her pen and begin working again without pausing, without looking up, without giving any sign at all that she was aware of the room around her. She was good at her work. Even Wren, who had no particular knowledge of cartography, could see it. The focused economy of her movements, the way she held the pen, the way her eyes moved between reference points with a confidence that was not arrogance but simply competence. He thought about what Caden had said. She just decided, and then did it. He thought about the 11 years he had spent watching Caden navigate a world in which almost everything bent toward him. Doors opened, people agreed. Situations resolved themselves in his favor with a frequency that would have ruined a lesser man's relationship with reality. He thought about how much work it had taken, quietly and continuously, to keep Caden's feet on the ground and his sense of proportion intact. He thought about a woman who had stood 6 feet from the king and said no, clearly and without fuss, and then gone back to her maps. He was not sure if this was a good thing or an extremely complicated thing. He was increasingly sure it was not a simple thing. He set down his plate and went back to find the next set of documents they needed for the afternoon session. Because whatever was happening between his king and the cartographer, the water rights agreement was still waiting, and ambiguous language in the second sentence of the third clause was not going to fix itself. The afternoon sessions ran long. By the time they finished, the light through the summit complex windows had gone from gold to amber to the flat gray of early evening, and Wren's back ached from sitting in the formal chairs, and his head ached from the particular strain of legal language, and he wanted a cup of tea and an hour of silence. He did not get either. What he got instead was Caden appearing at the door of the side chamber and saying, without any preamble, "She maps places that aren't on the official surveys." Wren looked at him. "The Eastern Ridge correction she finished last night. I looked at it this morning. It references locations that aren't in any of the official territorial records." Caden came fully into the room and set a copy of Lyra's completed map on the table. She went there herself. She walked the actual land. Wren looked at the map. He was not a cartographer, but he understood enough to see that the level of detail in what was spread in front of him was extraordinary. The Eastern Ridge boundary had been a source of dispute for decades. He had read the relevant history in preparation for this summit. No one had managed to produce a clean resolution because no one had been willing to do the physical work of going into the ridge itself and recording what was actually there. Someone had. She did this alone? He said. As far as I can tell. Ren studied the map. He looked at the notation in the lower right corner, where cartographers recorded their methodology. It was written in a small, precise hand. Dates, waypoints, instruments used, weather conditions, everything you would need to verify the survey independently. She went in November, he said. Yes. The ridge in November is... Ren stopped. He looked up. That's not easy country in November. No, Caden said. It isn't. There was a pause. She maps things nobody else bothers to document, Caden said, and his voice had shifted slightly, quieter, with a quality that Ren did not often hear from him, something that was not quite wonder, but was in the same neighborhood. Ren looked at him. You're not talking about cartography, he said. Caden picked up the map and rolled it carefully and set it aside. Get some rest, he said. Long day tomorrow. He left. Ren stood in the empty room and looked at the place where the map had been, and thought about a woman who walked into difficult country in November to correct a 130-year-old mistake that everyone else had decided was too hard to fix. He went and got his tea. He did not entirely know what he was rooting for. He knew that he was, obscurely, rooting for something, and he did not feel good about that at all. The summit's last evening dinner was the kind of event that Ren had learned to endure rather than enjoy. Too many people in a room that was slightly too warm, with food that was technically excellent and practically impossible to eat, while also managing 17 conversations simultaneously. He had developed a talent for it over the years. He could hold a drink, maintain eye contact, respond intelligently to whatever was being said to him, and also track the room with the peripheral attention of someone who was professionally obligated to know where everyone was at all times. Tonight he was tracking two people. Caden, at the main table, was in conversation with the Eastern Governor and the delegate from the Holloway Pack, talking about the River Rights subsection with the focused attention of a man who was genuinely interested in what he was discussing. His hands were in his lap, both of them, not touching his jaw. Ren noted this with cautious relief. Lyra was not at the dinner. She was not required to be. Ren had noticed that she was not at most of the social events that the summit organized around its formal sessions. She appeared for the working hours, she produced extraordinary work, and she removed herself during the hours that were not about work. He found this admirable in principle and slightly difficult in practice, because it meant that she and Caden had fewer chances to collide, which was probably good, but it also meant that Caden was spending more time in the same room as her absence, which was creating a particular quality of attention that Ren was not sure was healthy. He had watched men fall hard before. It was never pretty, even when it was warranted. He excused himself from the conversation he was in and stepped out onto the narrow terrace that ran along the outside of the dining hall. The night air was clean and cold, with a sharpness that pushed back against the indoor warmth. He stood at the railing and breathed it in. Below the terrace, across the courtyard, a light was on in the workroom wing. He watched it for a moment. She was still working. Of course she was. The summit was ending in 2 days and she had more maps to finish, and she was the kind of person who finished what she started. He thought about what Caden had said. She maps things nobody else bothers to document. He thought about what it meant that Caden had gone and looked at her map first thing in the morning, while the rest of them were still at breakfast. He thought about a 19-year-old who had stood in a public hall and said no to a fated bond, clearly and calmly, and then gone back to her desk. He was not, he admitted to himself, entirely sure that she was wrong. He had served Caden for 11 years. He knew what Caden was. He knew the good of it and the difficulty of it and the long, complex history of a man who had been given enormous power very young and had spent a decade trying to wield it responsibly, with incomplete success and genuine effort. He admired his king. He trusted him, within limits that were maintained carefully and revisited regularly. But he also knew what it was to be the thing that a powerful man wanted. He was not sure Lyra Ashvale had signed up for that. He turned and went back inside. The dinner went on for another hour. At the end of it, during the final informal gathering over the dessert course, Ren positioned himself near enough to his king to catch the quiet moment when Caden's eyes moved, briefly and involuntarily, to the window that faced the direction of the workroom wing. 3 seconds, no more. Then back to the conversation, back to the Eastern Governor, back to the River Rights subsection, and the language that still needed careful attention before tomorrow morning. Ren ate his dessert and said nothing. But he turned it over all the way back to his room, and in the morning he turned it over again, and he still had not arrived at a comfortable conclusion when he knocked on Caden's door at 7 o'clock. and they sat down over coffee to review the morning's agenda. "She's leaving on the last day," Caden said, without looking up from the briefing document. "Who told you that?" "The committee coordinator," I asked. Wren put down his coffee cup carefully. "You asked the coordinator when the cartographer was leaving?" "Yes." Casually. Professionally. "Her maps are part of the summit record. I needed to know when they'd be finalized." He turned a page. "She finishes tomorrow. The last map goes in the day after, and she leaves the same morning." Wren picked up his coffee again. He looked out the window. "Caden," he said. "Don't. I'm not. I'm just asking you to think about what you're doing." "I know what I'm doing." "Do you?" Caden set down the document and looked at Wren with an expression of genuine patience. "I asked one question of the committee coordinator. I'm not planning anything, Wren. I just wanted to know. Why?" The pause was shorter than Wren expected. "Because knowing matters," Caden said. "I don't know why, it just does." Wren looked at him. He thought, "This is going to be interesting." He thought, "I hope she knows what she's walked into." He thought, "She probably knows exactly what she's walked into, and that is why she said no, and that might be the most intelligent thing anyone has done in this building all week." "All right," he said. "The morning agenda." They went back to work. But in the hall, an hour later, when Lyra Ashvale walked past with her map case on her way to her workroom, and Caden stopped mid-sentence for exactly one breath before continuing, and Lyra did not look up, did not slow down, did not give any sign at all of having noticed anything, Wren watched both of them with the focused professional attention of a man who has accepted, against his better judgment, that he is going to be watching this for a while. He wrote in the margin of his notes, "Complicated." He looked at it. He crossed it out and wrote, "Very complicated." He left it at that. The eastern borderlands had been disputed for so long that the people living in them had stopped calling them the eastern borderlands. They called them the middle, because that was what they were, the ground between things, belonging to none of the surrounding packs in any official sense, governed by nothing but the agreement of the families who had been there long enough to have buried their grandparents in it. Lyra had first come here 4 years ago, following a thread in her father's old survey notes that mentioned a valley that did not appear on any official territorial map. She had found it, a long green basin tucked between two ridge spurs, with a river running through it that was not documented anywhere, feeding into the official waterway system through a junction that every pack engineer on either side had somehow managed to miss. She had mapped it. She had noted the families living there, 8 of them, about 60 people in total, and their structures and their fields and the way they had organized their water access over 4 generations. She had filed the map with the Territorial Archive and received, in return, a form letter acknowledging receipt. Nobody had done anything with it. She had gone back. She had been going back every year since. She had mapped the valley in every season and in several kinds of weather, and she had expanded the survey to include the corridors leading into and out of it, the paths that the middle families used to reach the nearest market towns, the ridges they crossed to access the upland grazing, the places where the unofficial territorial boundaries made their daily lives more difficult than they needed to be. She had 3 notebooks worth of evidence that the official maps were wrong, that the middle people existed and mattered, and that nobody with the authority to do anything about it had ever bothered to look. It was the 4th day of her stay in the borderlands when Caden found her. She did not know he was coming. She did not know he was in the borderlands at all. She had spent the week after the summit returning to her independent work, which had brought her here, as it always did in late spring. The Middle Valley was easiest to survey in May, when the snow was off the ridge paths and before the summer growth made the sight lines difficult. She was on the eastern ridge above the valley, taking bearings from a rock outcrop that gave her a clear view of 3 reference points simultaneously, when she heard footsteps on the path below and looked down and saw him. He was alone. She looked around, automatically, for the security detail that should have been with him. The Alpha King did not travel without protection, not in unclaimed territory, not ever. There was no one. He looked up and saw her on the ridge. She looked at him. He raised a hand, not a wave exactly, more an acknowledgement. Then he kept walking up the path. She turned back to her bearings and finished recording them, because the light was right, and if she stopped now she would lose the angle and have to come back tomorrow. She heard him reach the top of the path and settle somewhere behind her, with the particular kind of quietness that people use when they are trying not to disturb someone who is working. She finished her notation. She capped her pen. She turned around. He was sitting on a flat rock about 15 feet away, with his arms on his knees, looking out at the valley. He had not dressed like a king today. He was in plain traveling clothes, a dark coat, boots that had seen real use. His hair was doing the thing it did when he had been walking in wind, which was approximately the same thing it did when he had not been walking in wind, which was to say it was slightly too long, and not particularly arranged. "You're alone," she said. "Yes. That's not safe. The people in the valley know I'm here. 3 of them walked me up to the path this morning." He paused. "The Greens. They wanted me to see the boundary correction." Lyra looked at him. He looked back at her, steadily, with that quality he had of giving a thing his full attention, without making it feel like pressure. "You sent them a copy of the correction," he said, "before the summit filed the official version." "They needed to know," she said. "The boundary correction affects their water access directly. They should have been the first people to see it, not the last." "They showed it to me this morning," he said. Owen Green spent 40 minutes explaining what it means for the southern field access. Something in his voice was careful, the way voices get careful when they are managing something that wants to be more. He said the field has been in the family for 100 years, and they've never had full legal right to the water that feeds it. "They have it now," Lyra said. "Because of your map." She turned back to look at the valley. From up here she could see the Green family's fields, the southern ones, the long rectangles of cultivated ground that stretched toward the river junction. From a height you could see clearly the path the water took, the way it reached the fields naturally if you simply did not block it with an incorrect boundary line. "How did you know I was here?" she said. "Your itinerary is part of the summit record," he said. "The committee has your planned survey locations on file." She had filed that itinerary as a professional courtesy, expecting that no one would ever look at it. She filed everything as a professional courtesy. It was a habit her father had drilled into her. Document everything. Tell people what you're doing. Leave a clear record. She had not considered that the record might be read by a king who had a reason to look. "That was one question," Caden said. "I asked it because I wanted to understand your work better, not to find you." He paused. "Finding you was a consequence." She looked at him. "Is there a difference?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. "The intent was the work. The outcome was..." He stopped. He tried again. "I wanted to understand what you map and why. I've been reading your filed surveys." "All of them?" "The ones in the territorial archive. There are 47. Lyra was quiet for a moment. She had not known that anyone had read all 47. "They're good," he said simply. "They're extraordinary, actually. The work on the northern corridor from 2 years ago. The wetland survey before that. Nobody else is doing this. Nobody else thinks it's worth doing. Why do you?" She looked at the valley. She thought about how to answer that, whether to give him the short version, the polite version, the version that closed the conversation down. Then she thought about Owen Green walking a king up to a ridge path this morning, to show him a boundary correction, and she decided on the honest version. "Because the maps are wrong," she said. "The official maps show a version of this territory that serves the packs that have always had power. They leave out the places that don't fit neatly into pack structure. They leave out the people who live there." She gestured at the valley below them. 60 people live down there. They've been here for 100 years. They're not on any official map, which means legally, in the way that matters, they don't exist. Their fields don't exist. Their water rights don't exist." She paused. "I fixed the maps because someone should." He was quiet for long enough that she thought she might have said too much. Then he said, "Show me the worst one." She looked at him. "The worst correction you've found," he said. "The most significant error. The one that's causing the most damage." She studied him. She was trying to work out whether this was genuine, or whether it was something else. The kind of interest that powerful men performed when they wanted something from you. She had seen both kinds, and she knew the difference. She was trying to place him correctly. His hands were resting on his knees. Quiet. Open. She reached into her bag and pulled out the second notebook, the one she did not show people, the one that was not filed anywhere, the one she had been building for 3 years and had not yet decided what to do with. She held it for a moment. Then she opened it and handed it to him. He took it and looked at the first page. She watched his face. He read slowly and carefully, the way a person reads when they are actually absorbing what is on the page rather than performing the act of reading. She watched him move through the first 10 pages, the documentation of the northern corridor, the survey records she had found that showed a different picture of the land than what appeared in the official histories, the records of what had happened when the 2 pictures conflicted. He turned a page and went still. She knew which page it was. It was the one with the records from 1987, the year that 3 families in the Ashburn corridor had been removed from land they had farmed for 50 years because a boundary survey conducted by a territorial official had drawn the line 200 yards east of where it actually lay. The families had been given compensation that amounted to a fraction of what the land was worth and relocated to pack-controlled territory, where they had no established rights and no community. The original surveyor's name was in the official record. The territorial authority that had approved the survey was in the official record. What was not in any official record was that the surveyor had been paid a specific sum of money by the pack that gained the land. Lyra had found the payment record in a private archive in the Central Territory. It had taken her 18 months. Caden looked at the page for a long time. "How many more like this?" he said. "In that notebook? 11. He looked at her. "This is why you map unclaimed territory," he said. It was not a question. He was putting together what he had not previously understood. "It's not just accuracy, you're building evidence." "I'm doing my job," she said. "My job is to show what is actually there. You're doing considerably more than that. Someone should." He closed the notebook carefully and held it out to her. She took it and put it back in her bag. The light was changing on the valley below them, the afternoon moving toward the particular gold of late afternoon in May, when everything went warm and lengthened. She needed to take 2 more sets of bearings before she lost the angle. "Why haven't you published this?" he said. "Because publishing without the right backing just makes the evidence easier to discredit. You need the evidence, the platform, and the protection. I have the first." She put the bag strap back on her shoulder. "I'm still working on the rest." He looked at her for a long time. She looked back. "I need to take my bearings," she said. "Of course." He stood from the rock. "I'll leave you to it." He started toward the path. She turned back to her work. She was setting up the sight line for the second bearing when he stopped. "Lyra," he said. She looked back. "The platform," he said, "and the protection. If you ever, when you decide you're ready." He stopped. He was choosing words the way he always did, carefully, without rushing. "I would like to help with that. If you want it, no conditions." She looked at him. "That's not about the bond," he said. "That's about the 11 families in this notebook." He paused. "And the next notebook." She held his gaze for a long moment. "I'll think about it," she said. He nodded. He went down the path. She stood on the ridge and took her second bearing, and her hand was steady and her notation was clean, and when she finished she stood for a moment looking at the valley in the late afternoon light with the notebook heavy in her bag, and the pull in her chest pointing, as it always did, in a direction she was not following. But she was thinking about what he had said. No conditions. She went back to work. She took 4 more sets of bearings before the light finally failed her. In the middle valley below, the evening was settling in with the particular quiet of places that are not connected to anywhere larger. The sounds of the valley closing down for the day, livestock moving, doors, the smell of cook fires beginning to rise. She had stayed up on the ridge longer than she planned, partly because the bearings required it, and partly because she needed the air and the space after the conversation on the rock, needed the clean, uncomplicated work of measuring the physical world to bring her back to herself. She packed her equipment and went down the path. At the bottom, the Green household was lit up from inside, the warm yellow of a fire visible through the front window. As she passed, the door opened and Clara Green leaned out, a woman in her 50s with her grandmother's straight back and her grandfather's eyes, and said simply, "Come in and eat before you go back to your tent." Lyra had been coming to this valley for 4 years. She had eaten at the Green table 4 times. It was a specific and particular honor, the way that offers are specific and particular in communities that have learned to be careful about what they extend to whom. She went in. The kitchen was warm and crowded with the evidence of a household that had been here for 100 years. The worn places on the table, the hooks on the wall where things had hung long enough to leave marks. The particular accumulation of practical objects that builds up in a place when people stay put. She ate at the end of the table where she always sat and answered Clara's questions about the survey, and told Owen that the official version of the boundary correction had been filed and would take effect within 60 days, and watched the way the information moved through the room, the quiet satisfaction of people who had spent 40 years being told the water issue was complicated. It was not complicated. It had never been complicated. It had simply been ignored. "The king came this morning," Clara said, over the clearing of the dinner plates. She said it without particular weight, the way people mention things that are news, but are not yet processed. "I know," Lyra said. "I saw him on the ridge." Clara looked at her. Clara had the quality that some older women have of being able to ask a question without opening her mouth. Lyra met the look steadily. "He asked good questions," Clara said finally. "What kind of questions?" "About the water, about how long we've been here, about the families that were moved out of Ashburn." She set a cup of tea in front of Lyra. He already knew about Ashburn. Lyra wrapped her hands around the cup. He'd been reading the filed surveys. He didn't seem like a man who was visiting to feel better about himself, Clara said. Some of them do that. They come and look and leave with a clear conscience and nothing changes. She paused. He took notes. Lyra looked up. Small notebook. Dark cover. He wrote in it the whole time Owen was talking. Clara sat down across from her. Owen said he asked about the documents, the original surveys, whether we still had them. Do you? Some, the oldest ones. Lyra set down her cup. She thought about the notebook in her bag. She thought about what Caden had said on the ridge. I would like to help with that. And the specific, careful way he had said no conditions. She thought about the 11 families in her second notebook, and the 3 more she had found evidence for since she had started that notebook, and the fact that the evidence did not help anyone if it stayed in a bag on a ridge in the borderlands. Clara, she said, if someone with authority, wanted to see the oldest documents, the original surveys from the families that were here before the boundary disputes, would you consider letting them look? Clara studied her. She was a careful woman. She had the careful quality of someone who had learned exactly how much to trust and exactly when to stop. Would it help? She said. I think it might. Would it help us or would it help someone else feel like they'd done something? It was the right question. It was the question that the 11 families in Lyra's notebook needed someone to ask on their behalf. And here was Clara Green asking it at her own kitchen table, with the directness of a woman who did not have time for comfortable answers. Both, ideally, Lyra said, but primarily you. That's the only way I'd ask. Clara was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded once, the short, decisive nod of someone who has made up their mind and does not plan to revisit it. Tell him he can come back, she said. In the morning, we'll have the old files out. Lyra finished her tea. She walked back to the small camp she had set up at the edge of the valley in the flat space between the ridge path and the river. The night was clear and cold, and the stars were the kind that only appear when you are far enough from any town that the light doesn't interfere with them. Dense and specific, the kind her father had taught her to use as reference points when the compass was giving uncertain readings. She sat outside her tent for a while and looked at them. She was thinking about what she was doing. She had spent 4 years building the evidence in her notebooks and 3 years deciding what to do with it, and the answer she had arrived at was, wait until you have the right moment and the right platform and the protection to make it count. She was not a patient person by nature. She had made herself patient by deciding that the alternative, releasing incomplete evidence prematurely, watching it get discredited, watching the families in the notebooks lose the best chance they might have, was worse than waiting. The question was whether this was the right moment. The question was whether a king who took notes in a small dark notebook and asked about original surveys was the right platform. The question was whether she trusted him. She did not know the answer to that last one. She knew that he had surprised her twice. She knew that the pull in her chest pointed toward him with an accuracy that was not useful and not requested, and not something she could turn off. She knew that none of that was evidence. She looked at the stars. Her father had told her, once, on a long survey in difficult country where they had both been cold and frustrated and not entirely sure they were reading the terrain correctly. The only way you know if a map is right is to walk it. You can cross-reference all you like, but in the end you have to go into the territory and see if what the map says matches what's actually there. She had never forgotten that either. She went into her tent. In the morning she would send word to Caden that Clara Green was willing to show him the old documents. And then she would watch what he did with them. That was how you found out if a map was right. You walked it. 6 weeks. Lyra had not planned to be in one place for 6 weeks. Her work did not typically require it. She moved. From the borderlands to the northern corridor, to the upland valleys and back again, following the survey routes her father had laid out 40 years ago, and revising them as the land changed, as boundaries shifted, as the things that needed mapping kept appearing in the places that everyone else looked past. But the Middle Valley held her. It was the documents, partly. The Green family archive turned out to be larger than Clara had let on, not just the original surveys but letters, land records, the kind of dense personal correspondence that holds within it the history of a place more honestly than any official document. Lyra spent 3 days in Clara's kitchen going through it all, and at the end of 3 days she had filled 12 pages of her second notebook and she knew that she needed to go deeper, which meant staying. It was also the other families. Word moved in the valley the way word moves in small, careful communities, through the knowledge that someone had come, that someone was looking, that something might be different this time. By the end of the first week, she had been invited to look at 3 other family archives. By the end of the second, 2 more. The evidence was accumulating in her notebooks with the particular weight of things that have been waiting a long time to be seen. And it was also, she admitted to herself, because Caden came back. Not every day, not in a way that could be read as pressure or strategy. He came to the valley on a Tuesday morning with the same small dark notebook he had brought the first time, and he sat with Owen Green for 3 hours looking at the old land records, and he asked questions that showed he had been thinking about what he had seen the first time. He came back the following Friday and spent the morning with the Harper family on the north side of the valley, who had a boundary dispute of their own that predated the Green situation by 20 years. He came on a Wednesday after that and found Lyra on the ridge again and helped her carry her equipment down when the light finally gave out, because the second bag was heavy and she had pushed the survey longer than she should have. He did not ask about the bond. He did not ask about her answer. He came and he worked and he left, and in between she thought about him more than she intended to, and she corrected maps, and the evidence in her notebooks grew heavier and more specific. It was the Watchtower evening that broke the pattern. The rented room she had taken in the valley's only lodging house, a low-beamed building kept by a woman named Frances who had 4 rooms she let to seasonal workers and surveyors and the occasional traveler who came through on the long route between the market towns, had a narrow stair at the end of the hall that led to a square watchtower. The watchtower had been built a generation ago by Frances's father, for no clear reason that Frances could explain, and it served now as storage for things that were too large to fit elsewhere and too useful to throw away. There was also, at the center of it, beneath a leak in the roof that had been patched 3 times and would need patching again, a lamp that had stopped working. Lyra had mentioned this to no one. She came up to the watchtower on a Wednesday evening after dinner to retrieve a roll of drafting paper she had stored there, and found the lamp working. She stood in the doorway and looked at it. It was the same lamp. It had not been replaced. She could see the same age marks on the base, the same slight dent on the left side where it had at some point been dropped and not repaired. But the mechanism was clean, and the oil reservoir was full, and when she turned the wheel it came up bright and steady. She went back downstairs and found Frances at the kitchen table. "The tower lamp," she said. Frances looked up. Someone fixed it." He asked if he could. Frances said, in the tone of someone who had decided not to make more of a thing than it was. I said yes. He had the parts from somewhere. She went back to her accounts. Said he noticed you'd been going up there in the evenings to work by candlelight, and that's hard on the eyes. Lyra stood in the kitchen doorway. He had noticed she went up to the tower in the evenings. He had found out what was wrong with the lamp. He had asked Frances, not her, for permission, because it was Frances's building and not hers, and he had fixed it and said nothing about it and left before she came home. She went back upstairs. She sat at the small table under the newly working lamp and opened her notebooks and looked at what she had been building for 3 years, all of it spread out in front of her in the clean, bright light that had not been there this morning. She stayed there for a long time. She thought about what it meant when someone learned your patterns without making you feel watched. She thought about what it meant when someone asked permission from the right person. She thought about the difference between attention and pressure, between noticing and claiming. She picked up her pen. She sat with it in her hand for a while without writing anything. The pull in her chest was steady and quiet, the way it was on good clear days when she did not have anything else urgent to contend with. She had made her decision about the bond. She had made it clearly and deliberately, and she stood by it. What she was reconsidering, sitting in the watchtower with the lamp burning bright, was a different and separate question. She was reconsidering whether she had correctly categorized the person. Her mother had followed a bond with a man who used the bond as a reason to make every decision for her, who had interpreted love as ownership, who had been the single organizing gravity of her mother's life until there was nothing left of her mother's life that was not oriented entirely toward him. The bond had been real. The damage had been real. The two things had arrived together, and Lyra had grown up understanding them as inseparable. She had never, until recently, spent enough time near a man who had a claim on her heart to test whether the inseparability was necessary, or just familiar. She was not following the hook. But she was sitting here in the light that he had made available to her, and she was thinking about him in the way she thought about things she was not going to do anything about, and she was aware that the category of not doing anything about it was becoming less stable than it had been. She heard the door below, footsteps in the hall, Frances's voice saying good evening, and a lower voice responding. She looked at the staircase. He did not come up. She had not expected him to. He had never come to her uninvited. She heard him settle somewhere. From the quality of the sound, she thought the small sitting room at the front of the building, the one with the window that faced the valley. She heard nothing after that. He was quiet when he settled. She looked at her notebooks. She made a decision. She got up and went to the top of the stairs. "Caden," she said. A pause. "Yes? Come up." Another pause, shorter, then footsteps on the stairs, and he appeared at the top with his dark notebook in one hand, and his expression doing the careful thing it did when he was trying to make sure he had understood a situation correctly before responding to it. "The Harper family," she said. "The boundary records they showed you on Friday. Did they give you copies?" He looked at her. He looked at the notebook spread on the table. He looked back at her. "No," he said. "I have my notes. They kept the originals. I need to cross-reference them against the Cooper land records from the same period. The Coopers are the Northeast family. I haven't reached them yet." She pulled out her chair and sat back down. "If you can get copies of what the Harpers showed you, I can close the gap in the northern documentation." He moved to the other side of the table. He found the second chair, the one that she had never offered to anyone and had not known she was going to offer until just now, and sat down. He opened his dark notebook. "Tell me which records specifically," she told him. They worked for 2 hours at the table under the lamp that he had repaired, going through documentation side by side, not talking about the bond or the rejection or the 6 weeks that had passed, not talking about anything but what was on the page in front of them. At the end of the 2 hours, she had closed the gap in the northern documentation, and he had a list of the copies he needed to request from the Harpers, and she was exhausted in the clean, satisfying way of someone who has moved a difficult thing forward. "I should go," he said. He closed his notebook. He did not say anything else. He did not reach for the evening, did not try to stretch it into something it had not been invited to become. "Yes," she said. She did not say anything else either. He went to the stairs. He stopped at the top of them and turned back, once, and looked at her in the lamplight with an expression she could not entirely read. Not the careful, controlled thing he usually wore, but something more open, something that he was not quite managing to keep back. "Good work tonight," he said. It was a simple, plain thing to say. She had been told good work more times than she could count. It should not have mattered as much as it did. "You too," she said. He went down the stairs. She looked at the lamp. She said nothing, not out loud, not even to herself, not in words. She picked up her pen and went back to work, and the light was steady and clear, and outside in the dark valley the sound of the river was constant and unremarkable, the way that honest things usually are. In the morning, when she came down to breakfast, the lamp oil reservoir had been refilled. She had not asked him to do that either. She ate her breakfast and looked at the valley and thought about her mother's hands and the way the pull in her chest had felt last night. Not urgent, not insistent, just there, the way a compass needle is just there, pointing without demanding that you follow. She had said no and she meant it. She was also, she admitted, in the plain, honest way she admitted things she was not going to do anything about, beginning to understand that there was a difference between following a hook and choosing a direction. She was not sure yet what to do with that difference. She picked up her bag and her map case and went out to find the Cooper family's northeast boundary. She had work to do. The Cooper family lived at the furthest reach of the valley's northeast corner, in a farmstead that sat against the ridge like it had grown there rather than been built. 3 generations occupied it simultaneously. The grandparents in the old stone house, the middle generation in the new wing that had been added 15 years ago. The grandchildren everywhere else in the way that children are everywhere in a working farm. Ned Cooper met her at the gate. He was a big, quiet man in his 60s with the particular kind of reserve that was not unfriendliness, but simply the economy of someone who had too much to do to spend words on things that did not need them. "Miss Ashvale," he said. "Mr. Cooper, thank you for having me." He nodded and let her in. The records were in the back room of the old stone house, in a chest that had not been opened in some years by the look of it, layered under blankets and a set of tools that had been placed on top with the casual disregard of people who had forgotten what was underneath. Ned's wife, a sharp-eyed woman named Dot, who Lyra suspected ran most things, cleared it all off with efficient movements and lifted the chest lid and stepped back. "We never knew if they meant anything," Dot said. "The old papers. My husband's grandmother kept everything. My husband's mother added to it. I didn't throw any of it away because I couldn't be certain. They mean something," Lyra said. She knelt beside the chest. She spent 4 hours in the back room with a candle. The window was small and north-facing and gave very little working light, going through what was in the chest. It was dense, accumulative, the kind of family record that builds up when people are methodical and frightened and have learned the hard way that not having documentation is more dangerous than having too much of it. The Coopers had been at the edge of the northeast boundary dispute since 1931. The dispute itself had been settled, badly, and in favor of the pack that had the resources to contest it. In 1958, The settlement had reduced the Cooper land by a third and moved the family's access track so that reaching their upper fields required passing through land that was now technically Pack territory. 65 years of requesting access, 65 years of it being granted, conditionally, grudgingly, as a favor that could be withdrawn. She found the original surveyor's records at the bottom of the chest. She read them carefully, 3 times. Then she sat back on her heels and looked at what she was holding. The survey had been conducted by a territorial official named Barton. Barton's records were in the territorial archive and she had read them. They showed a survey conducted over 3 days in August 1957, with 12 waypoints recorded and a clear boundary line established. The records in Cooper's chest showed a survey conducted over 3 days in August 1957, with 12 waypoints recorded and a different boundary line established. Not different in the way of independent surveyors seeing things slightly differently. Different in the way of someone having drawn a second line after the fact, over the top of the first. She looked at the 2 sets of numbers for a long time. She was careful with conclusions. Her father had taught her that too. The temptation to see what you expect to see. To make the evidence fit the story you have already decided is true. She checked her own reading 3 times. She found Ned Cooper and asked him, without explaining why, to read the numbers off the original record independently while she wrote them down. His numbers matched hers. Barton's numbers in the territorial archive did not match either of them. She photographed every page of the Cooper records with the small camera she carried. She thanked Ned and Dot with the particular careful courtesy she used when she was managing something large that she could not yet talk about. She walked back across the valley in the late afternoon, with the photographs secure in her bag, and the numbers from both surveys clear in her memory, and the weight of what she had found settling into her chest like stone. This was not the same as the Ashburn case in her second notebook. The Ashburn case was about a bribed surveyor making a deliberate error. This was about a territorial record being altered after the fact. Someone had access to the official archive. Someone with access had changed a number that moved a boundary line and given a third of a family's land to a pack that wanted it. Someone who still had access. She needed to think about what this meant before she did anything with it. She needed to think about who she could tell, and what evidence she had, and what the right sequence of steps was to protect both the evidence and the families it concerned. She thought about Caden. She pushed the thought away. She was not ready to think about Caden in relation to this, not yet. She needed the question to be answerable on its own terms before she brought anyone else into it. She crossed the valley and went back to Francis's lodging house and climbed to the watchtower and spread everything on the table under the good lamp and began to work through it. At some point, Francis came to the bottom of the stairs and called up to ask if she wanted supper. "No, thank you," she said, without looking up. A pause. "He's here," Francis said. "For supper. I can send him up if you want another set of eyes." Lyra's pen stopped. She looked at the documents on the table. She thought about another set of eyes, and whose they were, and what it would mean to let them in. "Give me 10 minutes, she said, "then send him up." She used the 10 minutes to organize what she had into the clearest possible sequence, not to perform certainty she did not have, but because she thought clearly in organized space, and she was going to need to think clearly for this. He came up the stairs at the 10-minute mark exactly, which she noted without comment. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She showed him the 2 sets of numbers. She watched his face the same way she had watched it in the borderlands when she showed him the notebook, steadily, with the specific attention of someone who knows that the face is going to tell them something important, and they need to be paying attention when it does. He read both sets of numbers. He read them again. He looked at the photographs. His face went through something that she tracked carefully. First comprehension, then the controlled stillness that in him meant something significant was happening under the surface, then something harder, and more specific, that she would not have had a word for a month ago, but that she recognized now as the particular anger of a man who has confirmed something he had been trying not to believe. "This is the archive record," he said, "the one on the left." "Yes. And this is what they actually have." "Yes." He set them both down. He looked at the table for a moment, then he looked at her. "How long ago do you think it was changed?" he said. "Between 1958 and 1960. The archive version shows a different paper type on the waypoint record page. The paper changed in 1960 when the territorial office switched suppliers. The original Cooper document is on the older paper." He was quiet. "You've been building toward this for years," he said. "The notebooks, all of it. Not toward this specifically, toward the pattern." She folded her hands on the table. "This is a new piece. It's more serious than what I had before." Because someone changed the archive. Because someone with access to the archive changed it. And the archive has not been restructured since 1940. The same families have held administrative positions in territorial records for 3 generations. He understood what she was saying. She could see it. "You're telling me I have a problem inside my own administration," he said. "I'm telling you what I found. What you do with it is your decision." He looked at her for a long time. "Not just mine," he said. "Not anymore." She met his gaze. She had expected that to frighten her. The idea of being bound to someone else's decisions, of having her work tied to another person's choices and judgments and priorities. She had spent 6 years protecting against exactly that. She waited for the fear. It did not come in the way she expected. What came instead was something she did not immediately have a name for, something that felt like standing on a ridge and finding that the ground you thought was uncertain was actually solid. She looked at the documents on the table. "Then we need to think about the sequence very carefully," she said. "Yes," he said. "And we need to be certain before we move." "Yes." And I set the pace. My evidence, my family's, my pace. He did not hesitate. Agreed. She nodded. Outside, the valley was dark and the lamp was burning, and the river made its constant sound, and they spread the documents between them on the table and began to work. The third rejection was somewhere in the room with them, like weather, present and acknowledged and not talked about, because the work was more important tonight and they both understood that. He stayed until midnight. He went back to wherever he was staying in the valley without asking for anything he had not been given. She sat in the lamplight for a long time after he was gone, looking at the documents, and the pull in her chest was there as it always was, and she let it be there, and she did not say anything about it. But she did not push it away either. That was new. Ren found out about the valley the way he found out about most things, later than he would have liked, with more already in motion than he could comfortably manage. He had been in the capital for 3 weeks handling the administrative aftermath of the summit, filing the agreed documents, coordinating the implementation schedules for the boundary corrections, managing the significant volume of correspondence that a major territorial negotiation generates after the parties go home, and the real complications begin to surface. He was good at this. He had been doing it long enough that it had become a kind of rhythm, and he found a certain satisfaction in the work of making formal agreements actually function in the physical world. Caden had been in the field. This was not unusual. Caden traveled extensively and always had. He was not a king who governed from a desk, which was one of his better qualities, and occasionally one of his more complicated ones. Ren received regular updates. The updates from the past 3 weeks had been about the eastern borderlands, the boundary correction follow-up, the Middle Valley families, the Cooper land situation that had apparently developed into something requiring sustained attention. They had not mentioned that Caden was spending significant time with a specific person in the valley. They had not mentioned it until a message arrived from a territorial official who had heard from a market town contact, who had heard from someone in the valley, that the Alpha King was coming and going from the borderlands with a frequency that was attracting notice, and that he was spending that time primarily in the company of the same independent cartographer who had declined his bond at the summit. Ren read the message twice. He set it down. He picked it up again. He thought about 11 years of watching Caden navigate difficult situations, and about the water rights document, and about the copy of Lyra Ashvale's Eastern Ridge correction that Caden had brought to the side chamber and set on the table, with the careful deliberateness of someone who wanted someone else to understand why it mattered. He thought about maps and notebooks and a lamp that someone had fixed. He had a packed schedule for the next 2 days. He rearranged it. He arrived in the valley on a Thursday morning, having sent no word ahead. He found Caden at the Green household, sitting across the kitchen table from Owen Green and a woman Ren did not recognize, with documents spread between them and 3 cups of tea that had been there long enough to stop steaming. Caden looked up when Ren came in. His expression was the completely neutral one that meant he had known this was coming and had decided to let it come. "Ren," he said, "this is Margaret Harper, and you know Owen." Ren sat down, because there was a chair, and because standing in a kitchen doorway while people looked at you was uncomfortable, and because he needed a moment to read the room. He read it. Caden was focused and present in the way he was when he was engaged with a real problem. The man across the table, Owen Green, had the careful, watchful quality of someone who had learned not to trust easily and was in the process of revising that position. The woman, Margaret Harper, was looking at the documents with the concentrated attention of someone who was seeing, possibly for the first time, that the thing she had known her whole life but been unable to prove was now documented. There was no Lyra Ashvale. Wren accepted the cup of tea that Clara Green appeared from somewhere to put in his hands, and he sat and listened, and within 20 minutes he understood the shape of what was happening. The boundary records, the archive discrepancy, the pattern of altered documents that seemed to connect at least 4 families' land losses across the past 70 years. He was a good administrator. He knew exactly what this meant for the territorial governance structure. The implications were serious, the required response would be complex, and the process of establishing what had happened and who was responsible would need to be handled with the kind of precision that left no room for the sort of motivated error that had apparently been happening in the archive for decades. He also understood, with the growing clarity of a man who has been thinking about something for weeks and is now seeing the physical evidence, what Caden was doing here. After the morning session ended and Margaret Harper left and Owen Green went to check the fields, Wren sat with his king in the kitchen with the documents between them and said, without preamble, "How long?" 6 weeks in the valley, Caden said. 3 months total, including the summit. And she is working on this. Wren gestured at the documents. Among other things, she has multiple survey routes running simultaneously. Wren nodded slowly. He looked at the documents. He looked at the boundary discrepancy that Lyra had found in the Cooper records, which was now annotated in 2 different handwriting styles, her careful, precise notation and Caden's tighter, more angular one. Wren knew his king's handwriting as well as his own. "Caden," he said. "Yes. I'm going to ask you a direct question and I need an honest answer." Caden looked at him. "Are you sure," Wren said, "that what you're doing is helping?" A pause. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Wren stopped. He collected himself, because this required precision. She said no. She was clear about it, and I understand that this work is real and important and that her evidence is extraordinary, and that the boundary situation is genuinely urgent. He paused again. "But you are the Alpha King. You have enormous resources, enormous reach, and a personal investment in this specific woman. And I need you to ask yourself honestly whether, even without intending to, you are creating a situation where she is obligated to you, where she needs your help enough that saying no becomes harder to sustain." The silence that followed was long. Wren watched his king's face. It did the careful thing it did, the controlled surface over the genuine interior. Then Caden set down his teacup and looked at the table. "I've asked myself that," he said. "And?" "I don't know," he said. "That's the honest answer. I don't know with certainty." He paused. "What I know is that the work is real and she is not doing it because of me. She's been building this for years before I came into it. What I know is that I asked and she directed. The pace, the decisions, what gets shared and when, that's all been hers." Another pause, longer. "But I can't be entirely certain about what I don't intend. Intention isn't the only thing that matters." It was the right answer. It was also the most honest thing Wren had heard in a long time, from anyone, about anything. He looked at the documents. He thought about what he needed to say next, because there was more, and it was harder. "Is she all right?" he said. "Not about the bond. About all of this, the work. Is she managing it?" Caden looked at him with slight surprise, as though he had not expected that specific question from that direction. "Yes," he said. He paused. "She knows exactly what she's doing, Wren. She has known what she was building toward for 3 years. The discovery at the Cooper place shook her, but she was back at the table within an hour. She doesn't need handling. I wasn't suggesting she does." "I know." Caden looked at the documents. "I just want you to understand that this isn't something happening to her. She's the engine of it." Wren thought about that. He thought about 47 surveys filed in the Territorial Archive that no one had looked at until someone had a reason to. He thought about a woman who walked into difficult country in November to correct a mistake that everyone else had left alone. "Do you trust her judgment?" Wren said. "About the archive discrepancy, about the sequence." "Completely. That's significant." "I know it is." Wren drank his tea. It was cold. He drank it anyway, because he needed something to do with his hands while he thought. He had come here prepared to raise serious concerns. He still had serious concerns. The political exposure of a king publicly associated with a rejected fated bond was real and manageable, but not nothing. And the archive situation was going to require careful and coordinated response, and there were people in the territorial administration who would look at what was building in this valley and see an opportunity to make trouble. He also had, sitting across the table from him, a man who had just used the word completely, with the unguarded simplicity of someone who was not performing a position, but simply stating a fact. Wren had served 11 years. He had never heard Caden say he trusted someone's judgment completely, without a qualifier. He set down his cup. "I want to read the full documentation," he said. "Everything she's found. I want to understand the full scope of the archive problem before we decide on a response. She'll share it when she's ready. Can you ask her to be ready soon?" "I can ask." A pause. "She sets the pace." Wren nodded. He looked at the documents. He looked at the two sets of handwriting running alongside each other through the notation, the careful surveyor's marks and the king's tighter hand, together on the same page, working through the same problem. "One more question," he said. Caden waited. "Has she said anything about the other thing?" The pause was short. "No." "And have you asked?" "No." Wren nodded again. He thought about asking whether that was because Caden was respecting her answer, or because he was afraid of what her answer would be, and he decided that the line between those two things was not his to examine. "All right," he said. "I'll stay for 2 days. I want to meet her. I'll introduce you." "Tonight?" Caden looked at him. "She'll be in the watchtower until late." "Tomorrow morning, then." "Tomorrow morning." They sat with the old documents in the kitchen that smelled of tea and wood smoke, and outside the window the valley was full of the sound of people going about the business of a working day, and Wren turned over everything he had heard and tried to place it correctly, and found that he could not place it in any of the categories he usually used. He admitted to himself, not certain what was right here. He was certain that both of the people involved were trying very hard to find out. He supposed that was the most he could ask. He picked up the Cooper documents and started reading from the beginning. There was a lot to get through, and he was not going to have an opinion about any of it until he understood it properly. He read. He met Lyra Ashvale the following morning, in the small sitting room of Francis's lodging house. Caden introduced them without ceremony. "This is Wren. He handles the administrative side. He's going to need to understand the archive situation fully." And then, with the particular tact that Wren was still occasionally surprised to find his king capable of, found a reason to be elsewhere in the building. Lyra shook Wren's hand and looked at him with the clear, direct gaze of someone who was assessing him without embarrassment, the way that field people look at things when they need to know what they are. He looked back. She was shorter than he had expected. He did not know why he had expected anything. He had no particular reason to have formed a picture, but he had, and she did not match it. She was not large or imposing. She was neat and practical, with the particular quality of someone who moves through physical space with efficiency, and she had a stillness to her that he associated with people who spend a lot of time alone and have made their peace with it. She was holding a cup of tea and a notebook, and she looked like she would have been happy to return to both of them. "He told you to be nice to me," she said. It was not quite a question. "He suggested I be considerate," Wren said. "That's slightly different." Something at the edge of her expression moved. Not quite a smile, but the shape that a smile comes from. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She set the notebook on the table between them and opened it. "I'm going to show you everything I have," she said. "Not because Caden asked me to, because we're past the point where holding it back makes sense. The archive situation has a timeline, and we need to move while the evidence is fresh." "I agree," Wren said. "I'll go at whatever pace you need. I know this is a lot of information for someone coming to it fresh. I read the Cooper documents yesterday afternoon." She looked at him. "The full set?" "Yes." She recalibrated something in her assessment of him. He could see it happening. He was, he found, more interested in her opinion than he had expected to be. "Then you understand the core issue," she said. "Someone altered the archive record between 1958 and 1960. Likely someone with regular access. The list of people who had regular access to the Territorial Records Office in that period is not long. My predecessor's predecessor, and 3 administrative staff, all of whom are now deceased, which makes direct accountability difficult but the pattern traceable." He paused. "What I need to understand is whether this was a single event or whether there are more." "There are more," she said. "That's what the notebooks are." She opened the first one. They spent the next 3 hours going through it together, and Wren asked questions, and she answered them with the precision of someone who has been preparing for this conversation, and has also prepared for the possibility that the person she was speaking to might not be worth the preparation. He got the sense that she was continually deciding, in real time, whether he was the second kind or the first. He tried to be the first kind. Somewhere around the second hour, as she was walking him through the documentation from the northern corridor, something shifted. She stopped managing the information for him and started talking about it the way you talk about something when you are thinking through it alongside someone who might actually be useful. He noticed the shift. He thought it was a significant thing. When they finished, She put the notebooks away and refilled both their cups from the pot on the side table and said, "You're going to tell me there are political considerations?" "Yes," he said. "You're going to tell me that exposing a decades-long pattern of archive falsification is going to create instability in the territorial administration?" "Yes." "And you're going to tell me that the timing needs to be carefully managed?" "Yes." He paused. "And I'm also going to tell you that it needs to happen, not because Caden wants it to, because you're right, and the families in these notebooks are right, and the longer this sits in an archive, the more likely someone is to discover that it's been found and act to protect themselves." She looked at him. He met her gaze. "I've been trying to decide if you're useful," she said. "I know. I've been trying to demonstrate that I am." She almost smiled again. "You are," she said. "You understand the administrative mechanics in a way I don't. I know the evidence. I don't know the correct sequence for using it. Then we should work out the sequence together." "Yes," she said. "We should." They worked for another hour on the sequence, the correct order of disclosure, the supporting structures that needed to be in place before any of this became public, the protections that the families would need in the period between disclosure and resolution. When they were done, Wren had 4 pages of notes and a clearer sense of the whole than he had managed to build from anything he had read the previous afternoon. He sat back in his chair. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "That isn't about the archive." She waited. "Are you all right?" he said. "With all of this, the scope of it, the people involved." She looked at him for a long time. He did not look away. "I don't know yet," she said. "I'm answering the questions I can answer and leaving the others." She paused. "Is that good enough?" "That's very honest," he said. "I try to be." He blinked. He heard in the 3 words an echo of something Caden had said to him, in a courtyard, on the last day of the summit. "I try to be." He did not say anything about it. He collected his notes and thanked her, and she walked him to the door of the sitting room, and at the door she stopped and said, "He told me you'd push back if you thought he was wrong." "He did?" "He said it was one of your most useful qualities." A pause. "Was he right? Will you push back?" Wren looked at her steadily. "Yes," he said, "if I think he's wrong." She nodded, once. The short, decisive nod he was coming to associate with her final determinations. "Good," she said. She went back to her tea and her notebook. Wren went to find Caden. He found him on the low wall at the edge of the property, the one that faced the valley and the hills to the east. He was sitting with his elbows on his knees and his dark notebook open, but he was not writing in it. He was looking at the hills. Wren sat beside him. "Well," Caden said. "She's right about the archive," Wren said. "It's going to be a significant process to address properly, and it needs to begin soon." He paused. "She's also right about the sequence. I'll draft the framework this week." Caden nodded. "She asked me if I'd push back when you're wrong," Wren said. A pause. "What did you tell her?" "The truth." Another pause, longer. "She's going to be difficult to keep up with," Wren said, not unkindly. Caden looked at the hills. "I know. You seem pleased about that." "I am," he said. They sat on the wall in the afternoon light and looked at the valley, and Wren turned over everything he had accumulated in the past 24 hours and tried to decide what he felt about it. He felt many things. He also felt, somewhere underneath all of them, something that surprised him, a quiet, reluctant recognition that whatever was building in this valley, between these 2 people and this work and these notebooks full of evidence, was not the thing he had been worried about. It was something different. He did not yet know what, but it was different, and different was worth paying attention to. He opened his own notebook and started drafting the framework. The valley went about its afternoon around him, and the hills stayed where they were, and the river ran, and the work continued. The file was in the Northern Records section, behind a catalog reference that should have contained weather reports. Lyra found it on a Tuesday in early July, 6 weeks after the Cooper discovery, while she was doing a systematic cross-reference of every territorial record from the 1940s onward that touched on the borderlands. Wren had given her temporary credentials to access the archive remotely, a decision that had required its own careful navigation of administrative protocol, but that she had accepted without making anything of it, because it was a practical necessity, and she did not perform principles she had already exercised. She had been in the archive section for 4 hours when the file appeared in her search results. It was labeled Northern Corridor Land Assessment, 1952. It should have contained routine surveying records. She opened it because she was going through everything in that category, and she was being thorough. What was in it was not routine surveying records. It was a correspondence file. Personal letters, official memos, and one document that was not routine in any sense. A signed order, dated March 1952, authorizing the removal of a surveying team from the Northern Corridor because they had been producing records that, the order stated, created administrative complications for the recently finalized PAC boundary agreement. The surveying team had been 6 people. The order used the phrase administrative removal, which was bureaucratic language that had a specific meaning in territorial governance. The order was signed by the King of the Northern Territories, Caden's father. She read it twice. She sat back in her chair and looked at the far wall of the small office she had been working in, and did not move for a long time. The removal had happened. She found the records of it in the next file, not in the archive as it was officially structured, but in the gap between 2 reference numbers where something had been taken out and replaced with the weather reports. The evidence of the removal was in what was missing and in the accounts she had spent 3 years gathering from families in the Northern Corridor who had known the surveying team. 6 people, gone from the official record in the spring of 1952. She had known this. And she had known the shape of it from the family accounts, from the gaps in the files, from the way the Northern Corridor maps changed between 1951 and 1953 in a manner that no natural progression of surveying work could explain. She had not known who had ordered it. She had known that whoever ordered it had to have authority at the highest level. She had not let herself conclude who that was without documentation, because she did not make conclusions without documentation. She had documentation now. She looked at the signature on the order. She was very good at reading historical handwriting. It was part of her training, part of what made her effective in archives. She knew the signature. She had seen it on territorial documents from the same period in the official record, in the capacity of the man who had led the Northern Territory from 1947 to 1971. Caden's father had died in 1997. He had been revered. The territorial histories described him as a stabilizing force in a difficult period, a ruler who had navigated multiple crises and brought the Northern Territory into a stronger administrative position than it had occupied before his governance. The families in the Northern Corridor had not described him that way. Lyra had written their accounts in her second notebook, and she had understood from those accounts that something had happened in 1952 that the official histories did not contain. She had believed them. She had been building toward the documentation that would make that belief useful for 3 years. She sat with the signed order in front of her on the screen and tried to decide what to do next. The first thing she decided was that she needed to verify it independently, because she was not going to proceed on the basis of a single document discovered in a remote session without corroboration. She needed the physical file. She needed to see the paper and the ink and the actual object, not a digital scan. The second thing she decided was that she needed time to think before she told Caden. This second decision was harder than the first, and she spent time on it. She had agreed to share evidence as she found it. That agreement had been implicit rather than explicit, but it had been real. They had been working in parallel for 6 weeks with the understanding that information moved both ways. She had kept to that. She had told him about the Cooper records within hours of finding them, but this was different. This was his father. She did not know if he knew. She had learned, in her work, that not knowing was not the same as innocence. People could be positioned at careful distances from their own histories, could be told partial truths by people with interests in the partial truths, could live in structures built on things they had never been invited to examine. She had seen it many times. She also did not know what knowing would do to him. She thought about the way he had looked at the border families. She thought about the months of careful, patient work and the dark notebook with the small, precise writing. She thought about a man who had taken a question about his own behavior seriously enough to genuinely not know the answer, which was harder and rarer than it sounded. She thought about asking him if he knew and watching his face. She was afraid of what she would see there. She recognized the fear, named it honestly, and set it aside, because her being afraid of what she would see was not a reason to protect herself at the expense of the families in the Northern Corridor. She closed the archive session. She spent 3 days verifying independently. She found 2 supporting documents in physical archives in the Central Territory, a set of administrative summaries from 1952 that confirmed the removal through a different channel. She found a letter from a Northern Corridor elder written in 1953 that named, without using the formal title, the authority that had come down from above. On the 4th day, she drove back to the Middle Valley. She found Caden at the greenhouse, as she had expected. He was there most mornings now, working through the documentation that the families were bringing in, as word continued to move through the valley. Owen Green let her in and said nothing about the look on her face, which was either because he had not noticed it or because he had and was being kind. She went to the door of the room where Caden was working. He looked up. She said, "I need to show you something." "Not here." He read her face the way he read things, completely, without pretending not to. He stood. "Now?" "Yes." He followed her out of the house and across the valley, to the path that led up the ridge. They walked in silence. She did not explain as they walked because she needed to do this properly, needed to not rush it. They reached the rock outcrop at the top of the path. She had been here before. She always came back to this place when she needed to see clearly. She took out the photographs she had made of the archive documents. She had printed them at the market town, 3 copies on good paper, because she was always prepared. She handed them to him. He took them. She watched him read. She had watched his face in the borderlands when she showed him the first notebook. She had watched it at the Cooper kitchen table when he saw the discrepancy in the boundary records. She had watched it in the watchtower over hours of shared work. She knew his face now. She knew the gradations of it. She watched him reach the signature. The stillness that came over him was different from his usual controlled stillness. It was deeper, older, the stillness of something that goes all the way down. He read it again, and again. He looked at the valley below. He was quiet for a very long time. "How certain are you?" he said. His voice was steady. "I have 3 independent sources. The original archive document, the administrative summary from the Central Territory, and a witness account from 1953. She paused. "I spent 4 days verifying before I came to you." He nodded slowly. She waited. "I didn't know the specifics," he said. "I knew something had happened in the Northern Corridor in the early 50s. There were family stories, things that didn't quite fit the official history. I asked about it once, when I was young. I was told it was a complicated period." He paused. "I decided I believed that. I don't know if I actually believed it or if I decided to. That was honest. It was the most honest thing she had heard anyone say about their own history." "Caden," she said. He looked at her. "What do you want to do with this?" He looked at the photographs in his hands. He looked at his father's signature. "I want to acknowledge it," he said. "Formally, publicly, to the families." He paused. "I want to put it in the official record, the real record." Another pause. "I want to do it right, which means I need to understand the full scope first, and build the right structure for the disclosure." He looked at her. "How many more?" "I don't know yet. This is what I've found. There may be others. Then we keep looking." She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "We keep looking." He nodded. He looked at the valley one more time. Then he carefully folded the photographs and put them inside his dark notebook. They stood on the ridge together and said nothing for a while, because there was nothing to say yet, and sometimes the honest response to something large is to simply stand with it until you know what you are going to do. She was standing with it. He was standing with it. The valley was below them and the sky was clear, and after a long while he said, quietly, without looking at her, "Thank you for telling me. I said I would share what I found." "I know." A pause. "Thank you anyway." She looked at the horizon. The pull in her chest was there, as it always was, steady and undemanding. She let it be there. "We should go back," she said. "Yes," he said. They went down the path together, and the valley received them at the bottom, and the work was waiting, and they went back to it. The following week was the hardest one. Not because of the work had its own momentum now, and the framework that Wren had drafted was solid, and the evidence was strong enough that moving forward felt less like a leap, and more like placing a foot on solid ground. The work was the clearest thing in her days. The hard part was what the week showed her about Caden. She watched him the way she watched everything, carefully, without announcing it. She watched him carry the photograph of his father's signature around in his dark notebook, alongside his field notes and his meeting records and the administrative correspondence that she saw him reading and responding to at the green kitchen table in the mornings. She watched him keep working, the same pace, the same quality of attention, the same steadiness with the Valley families. She watched him call his administrative secretary from the Valley and ask for a complete index of the Northern Corridor records from 1948 to 1960. And when the secretary asked why, she heard him say, clearly and without elaboration, "Because I need to understand what happened there." She watched him go to the north side of the valley and sit for an hour with old Margaret Harper, who was 79 and had been 11 years old in 1952, and who told him what she remembered of the spring that the surveying team did not come back. Lyra was not present for that conversation. She learned about it from Clara Green, who had heard it from Margaret herself. What Clara told her was that the king had sat with Margaret for a full hour and listened, and at the end of it he had thanked her, and Margaret had said that the thanks were not necessary, that it was enough to have someone finally come and ask. She thought about that for a long time. She thought about what it cost someone to sit with a truth about their own inheritance and not look away from it. She had spent 6 years building the evidence for exactly this kind of accounting, the documentation that made looking away impossible, and she had met people, in the course of that work, who had looked away anyway, who had found ways to make the evidence feel insufficient or irrelevant or complicated. He was not doing that. She thought about the version of Caden Voss that she had formed in her mind at the summit, the powerful man with the claim on her chest, the thing to be managed, the force to be navigated around. She had been fair, she thought. She had not been wrong. Power was what it was, and she had been right to be careful of it. But she had also been building a map of him that had the same problem as the official maps of the borderlands. She had been drawing what she expected to find, rather than what was actually there. She was trying to correct the map. On a Friday afternoon, she found him at the edge of the valley where the path met the river, sitting on a flat rock with his notebook closed on his knee and his eyes on the water. She had been out to check a bearing correction on the ridge above. She came down the path and he heard her and looked up. She sat on the rock beside him without being invited. He did not say anything. She did not say anything. They watched the river for a while. "My father was not a bad man," he said finally. "In the ways I knew him, he wasn't. He was present. He took things seriously. He tried to do good work." A pause. "I have been trying, this week, to hold that and this together, and I don't know how to hold them together." She thought about it. "I don't think you're supposed to," she said. "I think people can be real to the people who love them and still cause serious harm to people they never thought about. The two things don't cancel each other out. They both have to be true." He was quiet. "That's harder," he said. "Yes." "It would be easier if he were simply—" "Yes," she said, "it would." He looked at the water. "Is that what happened with your family?" he said. He said it carefully. The way he asked things he was not certain he had the right to ask. The reason you made the decision you made at the summit." She had known this question would come at some point. She had been deciding for a long time how much of the answer to give. "My mother accepted a bond," she said, "with someone who was not a bad man in the ways she knew him." She paused. "He took everything she was and made it about him. Not deliberately, not cruelly. He just took up all the space, and she let him. And after 20 years, there was nothing left of her that wasn't defined by where he was and what he needed." She looked at the river. "She died when I was 19. She was 43. Another pause. "The bond wasn't the problem. The problem was that she believed the bond meant she had to become smaller." He was very still. "You were afraid of becoming smaller," he said. "I was certain I would. I didn't think the bond was separable from that outcome." She paused. "I'm less certain of that now." She had not planned to say that. She heard herself say it, and did not walk it back, because she had made a commitment to honesty with herself, and the honesty was pointing in that direction. He turned to look at her. She kept her eyes on the river. "What changed?" he said. "Evidence," she said. "That's all. I update on evidence." The silence between them was not empty. It was full of things that had been accumulating for months, the maps and the documents and the late evenings in the watchtower and the rock on the ridge, the lamp that had been fixed without being asked, the question answered honestly that no one else had ever bothered to answer honestly. "I'm not going to ask you again," he said. "About the bond, about your answer." She looked at him. "I know what your answer has been, and I know why, and he stopped. He looked back at the water. "I'd rather have what we have than risk it by asking a question that puts you in the position of saying no again." She considered that. "What do you think we have?" she said. He thought about it, the way he thought about things he was going to say only once, and wanted to get right. "Something real," he said, "that started as work and became more than work, that I am glad about every day." He paused. "Whatever you want to call it." She sat with that for a long moment. The river went on, and the light moved, and the valley was just the valley, unremarkable in the way of places that have been real for a very long time. "We need to find all of it," she said. "Before we start the disclosure process, every file, every altered record, everything your father's administration touched." She paused. "It's going to take time, a few more months at least. Then we take the time," he said. "And when we do the disclosure, it has to be complete. Nothing held back, nothing softened. The families deserve the full accounting." "Yes," he said, without qualification. She looked at the river. She felt the pull in her chest, steady and clear. the way it had been from the beginning. She had been mapping the territory of him for months, and she was beginning to know the shape of it. Not the shape she had expected, not the shape she had been careful about, but the actual shape, the real one, the one that required honest looking to find. She was still looking. She was not yet done looking, but she was beginning to trust the map she was making. "Caden," she said. He waited. "Don't ask me again," she said. "I'll tell you when the answer changes." He turned to look at her. His expression was the open one, the one he did not always manage to keep back, the one she had come to recognize as the real thing underneath the controlled surface. "All right," he said. They sat by the river until the light shifted and the evening started to move in, and then they got up and walked back toward the valley, side by side, not touching, with the work ahead of them, and the history behind them, and the pull between them constant and undemanding, like a compass that knows exactly where north is, and is content to simply point. The disclosure framework took 4 months to build. This was not because of the evidence was comprehensive and clear, and by the end of the 3rd month of systematic archival work, Lyra had documented 11 cases of altered records, 4 cases of unauthorized removal from the public archive, and 3 cases of what the legal terminology would eventually call fraudulent boundary assessment. The documentation was solid. It would hold up. It was the structure around the disclosure that required time. Wren had spent 6 months drafting and revising and consulting, carefully, quietly, with a small number of people whose judgment he trusted, and whose discretion he had verified, on what the correct framework looked like. The families who had been harmed had to be informed before anything became public. Legal structures for restitution had to be established in advance, so that there was something concrete to offer rather than a promise. The territorial administration had to be prepared for the accountability process that the disclosure would trigger. And the Northern Corridor families had to be asked what they wanted. This last part was not in Wren's first draft. It appeared in his second draft after a conversation with Lyra that had lasted 3 hours and had not gone the way he initially expected. "You've built a framework," she had said, looking at the document he had spread across the watchtower table, "for doing something to them, not with them." He had looked at the document. "What do you propose instead?" he had said, genuinely. She had shown him. The revised framework was longer and more complex and required a level of individual consultation that was going to add 2 months to the timeline. It also, as Wren had admitted to her and then to Caden, made the outcome significantly more likely to hold, because if the families had shaped the process, they had standing in the result, and standing was what made the difference between a formal acknowledgement and an actual resolution. Caden had read the revised framework and approved it without requesting changes. Wren had looked at the lack of changes for a moment and then put the document away. He was adjusting, he had found, to a mode of operating that was different from what he had known before. He was not sure yet whether different was better. He was becoming increasingly sure it was more honest. The consultation period ran from October through November. Lyra coordinated it, because she had the relationships and the trust that the families had extended over 4 years of careful, reliable work. She traveled the corridor and the valley and the upland holdings, and she sat with the families and explained what had been found, and asked what they wanted. Some of them wanted money, some wanted land returned, some wanted nothing but the formal acknowledgement in the public record. Some wanted all 3. Some wanted the name of the person who had signed the original order to appear next to the formal acknowledgement in the public record, the name of the king who had authorized the removal, even though that king was long dead. This last request Lyra had brought to Caden herself. He had read it. He had put the paper down. He had looked at the window for a moment. "Yes," he said. She had looked at him. "Tell them yes," he said. "It should be there. It's the truth." She had not expected it to be easy. She had expected it to be a negotiation, or at minimum a hesitation, a conflict between the instinct to protect a father's legacy and the commitment to honesty. She had been prepared to make the case. She had not needed to. She went back to the families and told them yes. The disclosure happened on a Wednesday in December, in the territorial capital, in the formal chamber that was used for significant administrative announcements. Wren had coordinated the timing so that all 11 families or their representatives were present. The chamber also contained the territorial press, the administrative council, and 3 alpha representatives from the neighboring territories who had been notified in advance as a courtesy. Lyra was there. She stood with the families. Caden read the statement himself. He had written it himself. She had read the draft, and it had not sounded like committee language, and she had understood from the rhythm of it that this was his. He read for 20 minutes. He did not soften the specific facts or qualify the specific name or describe the specific harms as complicated or contextual. He described them plainly, the way Lyra had taught herself to draw things, as they actually were. When he was done, the room was quiet in the way of rooms where something has shifted permanently. Afterward, in the corridor outside the chamber, Owen Grinned stopped Lyra with a hand on her arm and said simply, "You did this." He did not elaborate. He did not need to. She looked at him and said, "You all did this. You kept the records. You told the truth when I asked." He shook his head slowly. "You asked," he said. Nobody had asked before. She stood in the corridor and held that, and let it be what it was. Inside the chamber she could hear the press beginning to move, the sound of professional attention organizing itself for the questions it was going to ask. She could hear Wren's voice, already managing the sequence of the formal responses that would follow the statement. She could hear the particular acoustic of a large room in which something important has just happened and everyone is still deciding what to do next. Caden appeared at the corridor door. He looked at her first. Not at the families, not at Wren, not at the press, at her. She looked back. She had watched him in that chamber for 20 minutes reading the truth about his father in front of the territorial record. She had watched his face. She had not looked away. He came to stand beside her. They were not alone in the corridor. There were family members and legal staff and 2 assistants of Wren's moving back and forth, but they had a moment that was as close to private as the day was going to allow. "How are you?" she said. He looked at her. "Relieved," he said, which surprised me. "Why surprised?" "I thought it would be heavier." He looked at the chamber door. "It is heavy, but it's lighter than carrying it alone." She thought about 4 years of notebooks. She thought about her own particular relationship with that specific weight, the weight of knowing something that needed to be known, of carrying evidence that had nowhere to go until it did. "I know," she said. He looked at her again. She was aware, standing in the corridor outside the chamber on the most significant administrative day of either of their professional lives, of the pull between them. Not insistent, not urgent, just present, the way it had always been. She was also aware that something else was present, a history they had made together over 8 months, a record of showing up and doing the work and telling each other the truth, which was its own kind of evidence. She had said she would tell him when the answer changed. She was not going to say it in a corridor on a formal Wednesday in December. She was not going to say it today at all, because today was about the families and the formal record and the 20 minutes of plain speaking that had just rearranged some part of the territorial history. But she was going to say it. She knew that. She had been doing what her father taught her, walking the territory to find out if the map was right. She had been walking it for 8 months. The map was right. "Wren needs you," she said, because Wren did, and because there was a process underway that required attention. "Yes," he said. He moved toward the chamber. He stopped. "Lyra," he said, without turning. "I know," she said. He turned and looked at her. Something in his expression was very still and very open at the same time, the way it was in moments he was not managing. She looked at him steadily. "Later," she said, not as a dismissal, as a promise. He held her gaze for a moment, then he nodded and went back into the chamber, and she watched him go, and the pull in her chest pointed exactly where it always pointed, and she let it. Owen Grinned came to stand beside her. "What happens now?" he said. She watched the chamber door close. "Now the hard part," she said. "The records get corrected. The land cases go to review. It's going to be slow and complicated." She paused. "But it's started." He nodded slowly. "Will you keep mapping?" he said. "Yes," she said. "There's more to map." He made a small sound that was not quite a laugh but was in the same territory as one. "Thought so," he said. He went back to join his family, and Lyra stood in the corridor for another moment, with the formal noise of the aftermath filling the air around her, and the river sound of the valley still somehow present in her memory, and she thought about beginnings and what they required. She thought about what came after 8 months of walking a territory to learn its shape. She thought, more walking, different walking, walking without the map in your hand because you know the ground well enough now to feel where you are going. She straightened her coat. She went into the chamber. There was work to do, and when the work was done, when the families had their answers and the legal reviews were underway, and the last formal statement of the day had been delivered, and the press had their notes and Wren had his schedule, and the chamber had begun to empty out, she and Caden were going to need to have a conversation. She was ready for it. She walked into the chamber and got to work. The evening ran longer than anyone had planned. This was, Lyra had come to understand, The nature of significant events in territorial governance. The formal part was the beginning, and the actual work was the hours that followed, the conversations that needed to happen now that things had been said publicly which could not be unsaid, the questions that opened up in the space left by the answers they had just given. She sat through all of it. She sat through the family consultation period where Wren and 2 legal advisors walked each family representative through what the next steps looked like, the land review process, the compensation assessments, the timeline for the archive corrections that would affect the official territorial record going forward. She sat and was available when families had questions that went outside the legal framework, questions about what had actually happened, about what was known and what was still unclear, about whether this was going to last or whether it was going to fade the way that other promises had faded. She answered what she could answer honestly. She said clearly what she did not know. Caden moved through it all with the same quality she had been watching for 8 months, the complete, unhurried attention, the willingness to sit with hard questions rather than redirect them. She watched him talk to Margaret Harper for the second time, and the conversation was different from the first one, because the first one had been Margaret telling her story to be believed, and this one was Margaret being told that her story had been found in the documents and was now part of the official record. Margaret Harper was 79 years old, and she had been telling that story for 67 years. Lyra watched Caden listen to her describe what that felt like, and did not look away. The evening ended slowly, the way long events do. Not with a clear conclusion, but with people beginning to leave. First in 1s and 2s and then in larger clusters. The room emptying gradually, until it was only the staff and the last of the legal team and, finally, Wren counting through his remaining tasks with the focused efficiency of someone who has 9 things left to do before he can stop. "Go home, Wren," Caden said. 40 minutes, Wren said. "An hour tomorrow morning will do the same work." Wren looked up. He looked at Caden. He looked at Lyra. He put his papers in his bag. 40 minutes, he said, and went back to it. Lyra watched this interaction with the small private amusement that she had developed for the particular dynamic between these 2 men, which was the dynamic of someone who knew another person entirely and had long since negotiated the terms of that knowledge down to a working arrangement. "He's going to be 40 minutes, she said. "He's going to be 45, Caden said. "He always rounds down." She thought about making a comment about the value of accurate estimation and decided against it. They stood together in the chamber, which was quiet now except for Wren at the far end, and the sound of the building settling into the evening, and the particular quality of rooms where something significant has been done, and the dust of it has not yet settled. "Tell me something," Caden said. She waited. "When you found the file, the order from 1952, were you afraid of what I would do when I saw it?" She thought about it honestly. "Yes," she said. "I was afraid of 2 things. I was afraid you would deny it, and I was afraid of what it would cost you to not deny it." She paused. "I didn't know which would be worse." "Which was?" "The second," she said. "The cost." She looked at him. "I watched you carry it for 4 months, while we were building the framework and doing the consultation work, and you were managing everything else on top of it. I watched you carry the weight of it and keep working." He was quiet. "You didn't put it down," she said. "It wasn't mine to put down," he said. "The families carried it for 60 years. 4 months was not an unreasonable contribution." She looked at him for a long moment. She had not gone into a formal administrative disclosure and a 12-year survey project expecting to find a person she respected. She had expected the work. She had expected the evidence. She had expected the work to matter. She had not expected the person. "I told you at the river," she said, "that I'd tell you when the answer changed." He went very still. She was aware of Wren at the far end of the room, industriously working through his 40 minutes. She was aware of the chamber and the formal setting, and the quality of the day they had just had, which was not the ideal context for a conversation she had been building toward for months. She was also aware that she had said later in a corridor, and it was later, and she was not someone who said things she did not mean. "It's changed," she said. The stillness in him broke into something that she had only seen in moments he was not managing. The open thing. The unguarded thing. The thing that lived under the careful, controlled surface. "It changed a while ago," she said. "I've been certain for about 6 weeks. I wanted to wait until after today. Today needed to be about the families." "Yes," he said, quietly, "just that." "I'm not rescinding the conditions," she said. "I still set the pace. I still make my own decisions. The work is mine." "I know that," he said. "And I'm still going to say no sometimes. About things." "I expect you to," he said. "I would be surprised and disappointed if you stopped." She looked at him. She thought about her mother. She thought about the hands that shook toward the end, and the life that had been organized entirely around someone else's gravity, and the 19-year-old who had stood at a summit and said no because she had seen what yes cost. She thought about the difference between being pulled and choosing. She had been choosing, for 8 months, to walk the territory until she knew its shape. She knew it now. She was making this decision the same way she made every decision, with evidence, with honesty, with her eyes open. "Ask me tomorrow," she said. He blinked. "Ask me tomorrow," she said again, properly, with time and space, and not in a formal chamber after the longest day we've had in months. She held his gaze. "Ask me tomorrow, and the answer will be yes." He looked at her for a long moment. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she confirmed. He reached out, slowly, carefully, giving her time to register it and respond, and his hand found hers and held it, and she let it. At the far end of the room, Ren looked up from his papers. He looked at them. He looked back at his papers. He put the last document away and closed his bag with the click of someone who has just decided that 40 minutes is more than sufficient, and everything else can wait until morning. "Good night," he said, and left the chamber with the brisk efficiency of a man who has somewhere to be that is not here. Lyra looked at the door closing behind him. "He saw," she said. "He saw," Caden agreed. "He's going to be insufferable about it. He's going to be extremely restrained about it and extremely smug about the restraint," Caden said, "which is considerably worse." She looked down at their joined hands. She thought about the pull in her chest, which was there, as it had always been there, and which felt different tonight, not the pull of something unresolved pointing at the future, but the pull of something that had already arrived, something she was already standing inside of. "Caden," she said. "Yes. The answer is yes," she said. "Tonight, not tomorrow. I don't need tomorrow." She looked at him. "I just wanted it to not be in a corridor. I wanted it to be said properly." He looked at her with the open expression she had learned to recognize as the real one. "Yes," he said. Simple. Plain. The same word she had been withholding for almost a year, used back to her with the weight of someone who has been careful with it. She did not say anything else. She held his hand in the empty formal chamber while the building settled around them, and the territory outside reorganized itself quietly around the truth they had just put into the record, and the pull in her chest was exactly where it had always been, and she stopped navigating around it. She let it be what it was. She had walked the territory. She knew where she was. January was cold in the capital. Not the dramatic cold of the northern borderlands, not the kind that drove animals to shelter and made surveyors reassess their ambitions, but the gray, persistent cold of a city in winter, the kind that seeps through old stone and makes the spaces between buildings feel narrower than they are. Lyra had rented a flat on the east side, near the archive district, which was practical and also slightly grim, the way practical things often were. She had not been based in the capital before. She was based there now, because the land review process had entered its most intensive phase and required her testimony on specific documentary evidence approximately twice a week, and traveling from the borderlands each time was not sustainable. She had a desk in Ren's administrative suite, not by design, but because the first time she had come in for a consultation she had been given a desk to work at, and had continued to appear at it, and Ren had at some point made it official without either of them making anything of it. She was still mapping. The survey work had not stopped. It had shifted, more archive-based now, tracking down the documentary connections between the cases she had already documented and the ones she suspected existed further back. It was a different kind of mapping, but it used the same skills. Look clearly, record what is there, do not decide what you expect to find before you look. She was also, for the first time in her professional life, operating with resources. This took some adjustment. She had operated independently for 6 years on a cartographer's income, which was not a generous income. She had funded her own surveys, purchased her own equipment, rented her own transport when transport was needed. She had been careful and efficient, and she had managed, but there had always been the particular arithmetic of working at the edge of what she could afford to do. Now she had access to the territorial archive, to the administrative records, to the research budget that Ren managed for the review process. She had a digital research assistant, a young woman named Petra who was extraordinarily good at finding things in dense historical records, and who had, within 3 weeks of being assigned to the project, located 2 additional cases that Lyra had not previously known to look for. She was glad of the resources. She was also watching herself carefully for the way that resources could shift the nature of work, could make it easier in ways that were genuinely good, and could make it more comfortable in ways that were subtly corrosive. She had her notebook. She still did everything in the notebook first. She trusted the notebook. The relationship with Caden occupied a part of her life that she was still learning the dimensions of. It was not the thing she had feared. She had been waiting, with the particular vigilance of someone who has been correct about a danger for a long time, for the moment when it began to feel wrong, when the bond and the relationship started to organize her life around his rather than alongside it, when her own direction started to curve toward his gravity without her choosing it. The moment did not come. What came instead was something she did not have a word for, a kind of daily ease that she had not experienced before, and that took her several weeks to stop being suspicious of. The ease of having someone who knew the work and asked about it with genuine attention. The ease of being known, which was different from being watched, and which she had spent a long time not distinguishing between. She had dinners with him when they were both in the capital, and she had evenings alone in her flat with her notebooks when she needed them, and he did not read the need for space as a withdrawal, and she did not read his attention as enclosure. They had arrived, without formal discussion, at a balance that seemed to be based on both of them simply paying attention to what was actually happening rather than what they feared might happen. She was glad. She was also vigilant. She did not think you could stop being vigilant about the things that had cost you before. The archive discovery that almost derailed everything came on a Wednesday morning in the third week of January. She was cross-referencing land records from the 1940s when she found a file that she had not encountered before. Not because it had been missing from the archive, but because it was misclassified. It was under an administrative reference that corresponded to routine correspondence, and she had been working through routine correspondence from that period, because routine correspondence from that period had, twice before, turned out to contain things that were not routine. This one contained a letter. She read it. She read it again. She was very still for a long time. The letter was from a territorial legal advisor, dated 1948. It was addressed to the man who had been administrative head of records before Caden's father came to power, and it concerned a request for guidance on what the legal obligations of a new Alpha King would be if he discovered, upon taking power, that his predecessor had engaged in boundary fraud. The letter was thorough. The legal advisor had laid out the obligations clearly, the requirement to disclose, the mechanisms for restitution, the process by which the administrative record could be corrected. The letter had been replied to. The reply, in the same file, was from the new Alpha King, from Caden's father, in the first year of his governance. The reply acknowledged receipt of the legal guidance. It noted that a full internal review had been completed. It stated that no actionable evidence of boundary fraud had been found. Lyra sat very still. The internal review of 1948 had concluded there was no actionable evidence. She had been building the case that there was actionable evidence for 3 years. She went back through what she knew. She went back through the Cooper records, the Northern Corridor files, the 11 documented cases. She thought about the archive discrepancies they had already established, the altered documents, the changed numbers. She thought about the 1948 internal review. She thought, either the review was genuine and wrong, which was possible, or the review was not genuine, which was also possible, or the review was genuine, and the decision about what was actionable was made by someone with a reason to find nothing actionable, which was a third possibility, and possibly the most significant. She thought about who had conducted the review. She did not know yet. She found out in the next 4 hours, by going through the correspondence files that surrounded the letter with careful, methodical attention, following the reference threads from document to document the way you follow a path through dense country, slowly, one step at a time, confirming each foothold before you put your weight on it. The review had been conducted by 3 people. 2 of them had been territorial administrators whose roles she could trace through the public record. The third had been a private legal advisor. The private legal advisor's name was in the file. She wrote it in her notebook. She sat with it. Then she took her notebook and her coat and went to find Ren. Ren was in his office with 2 of his staff going through the schedule for the week's review sessions. He looked up when she came in. He read her face. "Out," he said to his staff. They went out. He looked at her. "What?" She put the notebook on his desk, open to the page with the name. He looked at it. His expression went through something. "That's," he started. "The current head of the Territorial Records Office," she said. "He has been in post since 1971. He oversaw the archive during the period when the documents we have already identified were altered." She paused. "He also conducted the internal review in 1948 that found no actionable evidence of boundary fraud." Ren looked at the name for a long time. In 1948 he was a private legal advisor, Lyra said. The Alpha King brought him into the official administration in 1951. 1 year before the Northern Corridor removal. Yes. The silence was the kind that happens when a puzzle completes itself, and the completed shape is worse than the incomplete one had suggested. The altered documents, Wren said slowly. The ones in the archive, the post-1960 paper on the Cooper records. He's had access to the physical archive since 1971, she said, which is after the paper change. But the 1952 documents, the ones on the older paper, the original Northern Corridor files, those were altered between 1952 and 1960. Before he was in the official post, which means either there was someone before him who had the same role, or he had access before his official appointment. Or both, Wren said. Or both, she agreed. Wren sat back in his chair. She watched him process it, the careful, methodical way he worked through implications, the same quality of mind that made him good at his job, applied to a problem he clearly had not expected this morning. This changes the timeline, he said. Yes. If the review in 1948 was compromised, then the history starts earlier than we knew. She paused. I don't know yet how much earlier. I need more time in the archive. Not the central archive, Wren said immediately. No, she agreed. Not while he has access. They looked at each other. We need to secure the physical documents, Wren said. Everything we've already found, before anyone who might have an interest in those documents becomes aware of what we know. I've been making copies, she said. I have everything photographed. He exhaled. When did you start doing that? 3 years ago, she said. At the beginning, I always make copies. He looked at her with an expression she had come to recognize as the one he produced when she said something that struck him as either extremely obvious or extremely impressive, and he could not immediately decide which. All right, he said. He stood. I need to talk to Caden, today. I know, she said. Do you want to be there for that conversation? She thought about it. Yes, she said. He nodded. He picked up his telephone. She sat in the chair across from his desk and waited, and thought about the name in her notebook, and thought about 1948 and 1952, and 70 years of careful, systematic damage done slowly enough that nobody had looked at the whole of it at once. Until now. She thought about what her father had said about maps. Show what is actually there. She was still showing it. There was still more to show. She picked up her notebook and started making notes for the conversation ahead. Caden came to Wren's office within the hour. Lyra had used the time to organize her notes into the clearest possible order, not because Caden was slow to grasp things, but because she had learned that the way you presented evidence shaped the way it was received, and this was a piece of evidence that needed to be received in the right sequence. He came in and sat down and looked at her, and then at Wren and said, How serious? Significant, Wren said. Let her take you through it. She did. She had expected the controlled stillness. She had expected the careful attention. What she had not expected was the moment, midway through, when she laid out the connection between the 1948 internal review and the man who currently ran the Territorial Records Office, when his expression shifted from controlled to something flat and hard and very specific. She finished. She waited. I know him, Caden said. I know you do, she said. He had worked alongside the records office director for 4 years. He had been present in administrative meetings where that man had given guidance on archive procedure. He had trusted the assessment of someone whose role was to be the authority on what the archive contained and what it meant. Did you ever? Lyra started. No, he said. Nothing that suggested. No, he paused. He's careful. He's been careful for a long time. 70 years, Wren said. Not him personally for 70 years. The position, the role. Caden looked at the notebook in front of Lyra. How much more do you think there is? I don't know yet. I need to work through the pre-1948 records from sources outside the central archive. If the pattern goes back further, the evidence will be in the local family records, the same places I found everything else. The archive itself can't be trusted at this point. He nodded. The local archives, he said. The family records. How long? Months, she said. Maybe longer, depending on what's there. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked at her. What do you need? He said. She looked at him. This was the question she had been waiting 8 months to hear asked in the right way. Not what do you want or what can I offer or what would you accept, but what do you need? It was a specific and particular question, and it meant what it said. Time, she said. Access. Petra. and the authority to request records from the local archives without going through the central office. He looked at Wren. The regional governor relationships, Wren said. Caden can write direct letters of authority. The local archives will cooperate. Then yes, Caden said. He looked back at Lyra. What else? Someone to sit with the records office director while the investigation continues, she said. Not to remove him. That would trigger alert. But to manage what he has access to going forward. Someone in the office whose presence creates a natural limit. I can arrange that, Wren said, quietly. And I need, she paused. She had been deciding whether to say the last thing, and had decided to say it. I need your commitment that when this is complete, when all of it is documented, we do what we did in December. We say it plainly. The whole scope, no softening. Caden met her gaze. You have it, he said. You've always had it. She nodded. She had. She had had it since the ridge in June, when she had shown him the notebook, and he had said, show me the worst one. She had it since December, when his father's name had appeared in the public record alongside the truth of what his administration had done. She had known that. She was saying it out loud now, because this was a new phase, and new phases needed the commitment stated clearly, not assumed from the previous one. All right, she said. I'll start with the Ashburn Regional Archive. It's the one most likely to have pre-1948 records that the Central Archive can't have touched. When? Caden said. Monday. He looked at her. It's Wednesday. I have 2 review sessions tomorrow. She picked up her notebook. Monday is when I can leave. He looked at her for a moment, with the particular look that had become familiar to her, the one that was not quite a question, but had something in it that wanted to ask one. I'll be back in 3 weeks, she said, answering the not quite question. Maybe 4. Take the time you need, he said. I will, she said. I always do. He almost smiled. She saw it. Yes, he said, you do. Wren was watching this exchange with the expression of a man who has fully adjusted his prior assessments of a situation and has arrived at a new equilibrium that he is choosing not to discuss. I'll have the letters of authority ready tomorrow morning, he said. Thank you, she said. She stood, picked up her bag, put her notebook in it. She looked at Caden. Come to dinner tonight, she said. It came out the way simple things came out when she was not managing them. Direct, plain, without subtext except the subtext that was there in everything between them now. He looked at her for a moment. Yes, he said. She went. She walked back across the Capitol in the gray January cold with her notebook in her bag, and the name of a man who had been doing careful damage for decades written in her small, precise hand. And she thought about the next phase of the work and what it would require, and how long it would take. She thought about her flat, which was practical and slightly grim, and about having dinner in it tonight, which would make it less grim. She thought about the pull in her chest, which was there, which had been there for almost a year, which she was no longer navigating around. She thought about her father and his maps, and the rule that had been the organizing principle of everything she had built. Show what is actually there. She was still showing it. There was still more to show. She was going to keep going until she had shown all of it. She turned up her collar against the cold and walked faster, because she had 2 review sessions to prepare for and a dinner to think about and letters of authority to collect in the morning. And the work was the work, and it was not going to wait. She was all right with that. She had never minded the work. She walked home through the gray city and the evening came down around her, and somewhere behind her, in Wren's office, Caden and Wren were having the conversation that people have when the shape of something they thought they understood has turned out to be larger than they knew. She had heard those conversations before. She had been the one arriving to tell people the shape was larger. She could not be in every room at once. She trusted Wren to manage what she was not there to manage. She had come to trust him over 7 months of watching him work, the same way she came to trust anything, through evidence, through pattern, through the accumulation of a person doing what they said they would do. She trusted Caden absolutely. She had examined that fact and verified it many times, and it remained true each time she checked it. She opened the door to her flat. She put on the kettle. She opened her notebook to a clean page and wrote Monday, Ashburn Regional Archive at the top and started making notes about what she needed to find. The kettle boiled. She made her tea. She sat at her kitchen table in the gray January city and worked, and outside the window the cold was what it was, and inside the work was exactly what it had always been. She was exactly where she needed to be. The Ashburn Regional Archive was better organized than Lyra had expected, and worse maintained than she had hoped. Better organized because the archivist, A retired schoolteacher named Gordon Webb, who had taken the position 23 years ago when the previous archivist died and nobody else had applied, had a systematic mind and had spent 2 decades building a cross-reference system by hand that was more navigable than anything the Central Archive used. Worse maintained because the physical conditions of the building were what they were, a converted mill on the edge of town, damp in winter, warm enough in summer to be a hazard for the older paper, and funded at the level that regional archives in small towns were funded, which was not enough. She liked Gordon Webb immediately. He was in his late 70s, with the particular quality of old teachers who have spent their lives making things clear. Patient, precise, not interested in impressing anyone, very interested in whether she understood what she was looking at. "You're the one doing the archive review," he said, on the first morning. "Yes." "For the central office, or against it?" he said. She looked at him. He looked back at her, mildly, with the eyes of someone who had been watching things from a modest distance for 23 years and had formed opinions. "Against it," she said. He nodded once. "The older materials are in the back room," he said. "The ones I was told years ago to discard and didn't, come on." He had not discarded them because he did not trust the instruction. The instruction had come, in 1982, in a memo from the Central Records Office, directing all regional archives to clear materials, predating 1940, on the grounds of storage limitations. Gordon had reviewed the instruction, found it procedurally irregular, and filed the memo in a separate folder labeled questionable, where it had been living for 43 years alongside 47 other memos he had found procedurally irregular. "I kept copies of all of them," he said, showing her the folder on the second morning. "The memos and the materials they asked me to discard." She looked at the folder. "Gordon," she said. This is extraordinary." "It's ordinary," he said. "I just didn't throw things away that I wasn't sure I should throw away." "That's not difficult." It was not difficult. It was also something that, as far as Lyra could tell from 3 years of archival research, very few people had bothered to do. She spent the first week in the back room, going through the pre-1940 materials that Gordon had preserved. She found 4 more cases, all predating 1948, all involving boundary discrepancies that benefited the same pack interests, all documented in ways that connected to the pattern she had already established. She also found something she had not looked for. It was in a private correspondence file from 1935, between a local land commissioner and a territorial administrator she did not recognize. The letters were about a specific boundary dispute that had been resolved in 1936. They were also about something else, a method, a system, a way of managing the archive so that certain records were findable for certain purposes and unfindable for others. The system had a name in the letters. The man who had designed it was referred to by title only, the keeper. She sat with this for a day before she mentioned it to anyone. She sat with it because it changed the scope of what she had been building. She had been building a case about a pattern of damage done over decades. What the 1935 letters suggested was that the pattern was not organic, not the accumulation of individual decisions by individual people who happened to want the same things, but designed, deliberate, maintained. She thought about what this meant for the disclosure process. She thought about what this meant for the families, the 11 she had already documented, the 4 new ones in Gordon's back room, the ones she had not yet found. She thought about Wren and the administrative framework they had built and whether it was scaled for what she was now looking at. She called Wren on the 3rd day. He listened without interrupting, which was one of his best qualities. When she finished, there was a pause. "How confident are you?" he said. "In the documents?" "Completely. In my interpretation? I want someone else to read them before I call it." "Who else?" "I don't know. Someone I trust who hasn't been inside this work. A fresh set of eyes." She paused. "Someone who will tell me if I'm wrong." There was a longer pause. "I'll come," Wren said. "This week. I'll bring." He stopped. "Actually, I'll come alone. 2 days." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," he said. "I want to read the documents myself." A pause. "Lyra." "Yes. You're not wrong," he said. "But let me come and read them." She exhaled. "Thursday." "Thursday," he agreed. Wren arrived on Thursday with a bag, a breakfast from the market town that he appeared with at Gordon Webb's door at 8 in the morning, and the particular focused attention that she had come to associate with him doing something he had decided needed his full engagement. Gordon made him tea and showed him the cross-reference system with the affection of one systematic mind encountering another, and by 9 o'clock Wren was in the back room with the 1935 correspondence. He read for 4 hours without speaking. She worked beside him, going through the next section of the pre-1940 materials, and they were in the particular comfortable silence of two people who have spent enough time working together that silence does not require filling. At 1 in the afternoon, he set the letters down and said, "You're not wrong." She did not say anything. "The keeper reference is, it's a system," he said. "It's been running since at least 1935 and possibly longer. The 1948 internal review was not a genuine review. It was a managed process by the person who designed the system to confirm that the system was not visible." He paused. "Which means everything we disclosed in December was accurate, but we framed it as a historical pattern. What it actually is a managed system that is still running," she said. "Yes." They sat with that. "The records office director," Wren said. "He's the current keeper," she said, "or holds the role. The letters don't name him specifically, but the structural position is the same." "How do we prove that directly?" She thought about it. "We find the current version of the management instructions. The letters from 1935 reference a formal document, a procedural guide that was maintained separately from the public archive. If it still exists, it will be in a private location, not the central archive and not any regional archive. Where? I don't know yet." She paused. "But I know who would know." He looked at her. "Gordon," she said. Wren looked at the door that separated the back room from the main archive. "He kept the memos," she said. "He's been watching for 43 years. He knows things about this archive and its relationship with the central office that he hasn't said yet, because we haven't asked the right question." Wren was quiet for a moment. "You want to ask him directly?" "I want to ask him what he knows," she said. "He's been doing the same thing I've been doing, in his own way, for longer than I've been alive. He deserves to know what we've found, and to make his own decision about what he shares." Wren looked at the door for another moment. "Ask him," he said. She went to the main room. Gordon was at his desk, cataloging a new accession of documents that had arrived that morning. He looked up when she came in. She sat across from him. "Gordon," she said, "I need to ask you something that might be outside what you're comfortable discussing." He set down his pen. He folded his hands. He looked at her with the mild, patient gaze of a man who had been expecting a question like this for some time, and had decided, somewhere along the way, that he would answer it when it came. "Ask," he said. She asked. He was quiet for a moment when she finished. He looked at his folded hands. Then he opened his desk drawer and took out a key, and he looked at it, and he put it on the desk between them. "The locked cabinet in the storage room," he said, "behind the post-1960 land survey boxes. I put it there in 1991 because I found it in a packet addressed to my predecessor, and I did not know what to do with it, and I did not want to throw it away." He paused. "I looked at it when I found it. I didn't understand all of it, but I understood enough to know it wasn't mine to throw away." She looked at the key. "What is it?" she said. "A procedural document," he said. "Very old, handwritten. It describes a method for managing which records are accessible and which are not." He paused. "It calls itself the Keeper's Standard. There's a signature at the bottom." She looked at him. "How old?" she said. "The handwriting is consistent with the late 19th century, he said. "There's no date on it." He paused. "But there are annotations, in different hands, added at different times." He looked at her steadily. "The most recent annotation is from 1948. She picked up the key. She got Wren. They went to the storage room together. The cabinet was behind the survey boxes, as Gordon had said. A small wooden cabinet with a lock that the key fitted precisely, and opened with the sound of a mechanism that had not moved in many years. Inside was a single folder. Inside the folder was a document. She read it standing in the storage room with Wren beside her and Gordon in the doorway, and the cold coming up through the flagstone floor, and the afternoon light coming through the high, narrow window. She read it and she understood the whole shape of it. She had been building the evidence for 3 years. She had been finding the pieces in the borderlands and the valley, and the family records and the regional archives. She had been mapping something that had seemed, at each stage, like a pattern of individual damage. What she was holding was the plan. The original, annotated, maintained plan, the document that explained how the archive had been managed and by whom and toward what end, from the last decade of the 19th century until a most recent annotation made in January of 1948. She turned to the last page. She looked at the 1948 annotation. She recognized the handwriting. She had been reading records in that handwriting for 3 years. It was the current head of the Territorial Records Office. His annotation, in 1948, was 3 sentences. It confirmed his receipt of the document. It confirmed his acceptance of the role. It confirmed his understanding of the method. She stood in the storage room for a long time. Wren did not say anything. Gordon did not say anything. She looked at the document in her hands and thought about the families in her notebooks, and the families she had not yet found, and the families who had died not knowing why their land had been taken, and whose grandchildren were still living with the consequence of a plan that had been running, carefully and quietly, for 130 years. "Gordon," she said. "Yes," he said. "I need to take this document into protective custody, outside this building, tonight." A pause. "All right," he said. "And I need you to understand that when this becomes public, your name will be part of it. The memos you kept, the document you secured, you will be a witness." He was quiet for a moment. "I kept the memos because I wasn't sure I should discard them," he said. "I kept the document because I didn't know what else to do with it." He paused. "If being a witness is what comes of that, then that's what it is." She nodded. She put the document carefully in her bag. She called Caden from the car park outside the archive, and when he answered, she said, "I have it. I have all of it." And her voice was steady, because she was always steady when the work was done. Because steadiness was what the work required, and she was what the work required her to be. And he said, "Are you all right?" And she thought about that for a moment, honestly. "Yes," she said. "I'm all right, She paused. "I'm glad it's complete." "Come home when you're ready," he said. She looked at the archive building, at the gray January sky, at the document safe in her bag. "Tomorrow," she said, "I need one more day with Gordon. He deserves to be properly thanked and properly briefed, and I'm not going to do it tonight when I'm still." She stopped. "Still what?" "Still carrying it," she said. "Give me tonight to set it down properly." "Take what you need," he said. She put the phone in her pocket and went back inside. She sat with Gordon Webb for 2 hours, and she told him the whole shape of it, and he listened with the patient, complete attention of an old man who had spent 23 years doing a small thing carefully, and who was now understanding, for the first time, the size of what that small thing had been part of. When she finished, he sat quietly for a moment. Then he said, "My predecessor kept the document because she didn't know what to do with it either. She locked it in the cabinet and gave me the key when I took the post. She told me there were things in this archive that were older than either of us and that I should be careful." He paused. I didn't understand what she meant. I think I understand now. Lyra looked at him. "Yes," she said. "I think you do." She left at 6, drove to the inn at the edge of town where she had been staying for 3 weeks, ate a meal she barely tasted, and sat at the desk in her room with the document in front of her, and wrote in her notebook for 2 hours. Not analysis, not documentation, just the particular kind of writing she did when something was finished, the kind that helped her put the weight of a thing down before she picked up the next thing. When she was done, she closed the notebook. She looked at the document. She thought about her father. She thought about a blank piece of paper and a pen and a voice saying, "The job is to show what is actually there." She had shown it. All of it. She turned off the light and went to sleep. In the morning, she called Wren and gave him the list of what the next phase required. The work was not done. It would not be done for a long time. The disclosure process, the legal reviews, the formal corrections to the territorial record going back 130 years. It was large and slow, and would outlast this particular phase of her life. But the mapping was done. She had found the shape of the whole thing. She drove back to the capital in the gray January morning with the document secure in her bag and her notebooks full, and the road was long and familiar, and she drove it without needing the maps. She knew where she was going. Wren had called her twice while she was driving. She called him back when she stopped for fuel on the long stretch between Ashburn and the capital, standing in the cold outside the car with her coat collar up and the document in her bag in the seat inside. "The records office director," Wren said, when she answered. "He's been in contact with the Central Archive." She was quiet. "He requested access to the 1935 correspondence files," Wren said. "Yesterday afternoon, after you and I left the Ashburn building." "Did he get it?" "The request is in the system. He hasn't physically accessed anything yet, but the request was filed." A pause. "Someone in the building told him we'd been there." She leaned against the car. She looked at the road. "He knows we're looking," she said. "He knows someone is looking. He may not know the scope yet." Wren paused. "I have someone in the records office. They're watching." Another pause. "Lyra, how soon can you be back?" 5 hours. "Come straight to the office." "Yes," she said. She drove the 5 hours with the particular focused calm that she had trained into herself over years of working alone in difficult country. The calm that was not the absence of urgency but the management of it, the understanding that panic was a distraction, and what the situation required was clear thinking and reliable movement. The document in her bag was safe. The copies were safe. She had photographed every page before she left Ashburn, uploaded them to the secure location that Wren had established at the beginning of the review process, made a physical backup that she had left with Gordon Webb in a sealed envelope with instructions about who to contact if anything happened. She had been doing this work for a long time. She had been careful from the beginning, because careful was what the work required. She arrived at the Capitol at 3:30. She went straight to Wren's office. He was there with Caden. She had not known Caden was there. She was not thrown by it. She sat down in the third chair and put her bag on the table and looked at them both. "He knows we have something," she said. "We think so," Wren said. "The access request is the tell. He's been in that role for 50 years and he's never previously requested access to the 1935 files. He wouldn't need to," she said. "He has the keeper's standard. He has the whole system in his head. The 1935 correspondence is evidence of the system, but it's not the operational document." She paused. "What he's doing is checking what's in the regional archive, checking what we found. Which means he knows we were there," Caden said. "Yes," she looked at him. "Which also means we need to move faster than we planned." He met her gaze. She watched him make the decision the same way she had watched him make decisions for 10 months now, completely, without performing uncertainty he did not have. "How fast?" he said. "A week," she said. "The full disclosure. Everything, the keeper's standard, the document from Gordon Webb's cabinet, the 1948 annotation, all of it." "That's faster than the framework assumed," Wren said. "The framework assumed we had time to build a slower disclosure," she said. "We may not have that time anymore." She looked at them both. "If he gets ahead of this, if he files anything, moves anything in the central archive, destroys something before we can access it, we lose evidence that the families need." "The secure copies," Wren said. "The secure copies are what we have," she said. "They'll hold up. But original documents are more powerful, and we don't know yet. What we don't know is still in the central archive." The silence was the kind that had a decision inside it. "1 week," Caden said. Wren exhaled through his nose. He opened his notebook. "Then we start tonight," he said. They worked through the evening and into the night. Lyra spread the document from Gordon's cabinet on Wren's table and walked them through it in full for the first time. The whole history of the keeper's standard, the method it described, the 7 annotations made across its history by 7 different hands, the final 1948 annotation in the handwriting she now knew as well as her own. She watched their faces as they read. She watched Caden's face with the particular attention she had learned to pay to the moments when he was encountering a history that was also his history, and she watched him hold it the way he had learned to hold it, without looking away, without softening it, without letting his own discomfort become the focus. His father's name was not in this document, but the system this document described was the system that his father had used. The men who had held the keeper role during his father's administration had been the men who had protected the boundary fraud that his father had, at minimum, known about. He held it. They worked until midnight. By the end of it, they had a revised disclosure timeline and a list of the additional family consultations that needed to happen before the public announcement. Wren had drafted the framework for the legal actions that the keeper's standard would enable, not just the boundary fraud cases they had already documented, but the broader accountability for the system itself. At midnight, Wren put his notes in his bag and looked at both of them. "I'll have the draft announcement ready by Friday," he said. "If either of you want to review it before then, you know where I am." He went. They were alone in the office with the documents on the table. She looked at them. She thought about the morning she had found the 1952 order on the archive screen, and the week she had spent verifying it before she told Caden, and the ridge in June with the photographs in her hand, and the December chamber with his voice reading the plain facts into the public record. She thought about a year of work that had moved from 3 notebooks into something that was now going to require a formal structural response from the territorial government with legal and administrative consequences that neither of them could fully predict yet. She thought about her flat, which was less grim than it had been in January. "Come home," she said. It was not quite a question. He looked at her. "Yes," he said. She gathered her things. He turned off the office light. They walked out into the Capitol night, which was cold and clear, and not the borderlands cold but the city cold, with the particular smell of old stone and winter, and the distant sound of the city still going about its business at midnight as cities do. She walked beside him and did not say anything. Because there was nothing that needed saying right now, and she had never been someone who filled silences for the sake of filling them. The pull in her chest was there. It had always been there. She had been navigating around it, and then walking toward it, and now she was simply walking beside it, and it was as steady as a compass and as unremarkable as breathing. She thought about her mother, and the hands that had shaken, and the life that had been made small. She thought about her own hands, which were steady, which had held a pen across 100 maps and were going to hold it across 100 more. She thought about the difference between choosing and being pulled, and how she had spent a year learning the difference, and how she knew it now in her bones. She walked home through the cold city beside the man who had learned to wait without demanding, who had learned to ask permission before fixing lamps, who had read the truth about his own inheritance and not looked away. She was not her mother. She was her own particular self, with her own direction, with 3 notebooks and a document from a cabinet that was going to change the territorial record, and her own maps of the borderlands and the valley, and the unclaimed corridors where 60 people grew their crops and raised their families in the places that didn't exist on the official charts. She was exactly who she had decided to be. She walked home. The pull in her chest walked with her, and she let it, and it was not a hook and it was not a gravity, and it did not ask her to become smaller. It was simply the direction of a thing she had chosen. She was content with that. They reached her door and she put the key in the lock and opened it, and the warmth of the flat came out to meet them, and she went inside. The notebooks were on the table where she had left them. The lamp was on, burning steady. She had not needed anyone to fix it. She had fixed it herself. The second disclosure happened on a Thursday in February. The chamber was more crowded than December. The family of the keeper's standard had grown. The legal representatives were more numerous. The territorial press had increased from 7 to 14 because word had moved in the weeks since the access request had been filed that something larger than the December disclosure was coming. The records office director was not in the chamber. He had been suspended from his position 3 days earlier, quietly and formally, with the administrative language that meant the situation had been assessed, and the decision made, and the process was now underway. He had not contested it. Lyra did not know what he had said in the private conversations that preceded the suspension. She did not need to know. She was with the families again. She stood with them the way she had stood with them in December, not in front, not managing them, but among them, because that was where she had always been. Caden read the second statement. This one was longer than the first. It had to be, because the scope was larger, because it named not just a pattern of boundary fraud but the system behind the pattern, and because the system went back to the beginning of the territorial governance structure and implicated not one administration but 7. And because the full accounting of what had been done required the full accounting of who had done it, and how, and for how long. He read for 40 minutes. She watched the room. She watched the families, the ones she had met in the valley, the ones from the Ashburn cases, the ones from the pre-1948 records that Gordon Webb had helped her document over 3 weeks in his back room. She watched them listen to the history of their own displacement, read plainly into the formal record by the man who held the authority to make that reading mean something. She watched Wren, standing at the side of the chamber with his notes and his particular kind of vigilant, professional attention that she now recognized as a form of care. She watched Gordon Webb, who had driven down from Ashburn the day before and who was sitting in the family section with the quiet, slight air of a man who has kept a thing safe for 30 years and is watching it be used for what it was always for. She watched Caden. She had watched his face for 10 months now, and she knew the gradations of it better than she knew most things. She watched him hold 40 minutes of plain speaking about 7 administrations worth of careful, maintained damage, with the names of the 7 men who had held the keeper role in the formal record beside the description of what they had done, and she watched him not look away from a single word of it. When he finished, the room was again quiet in the particular way of rooms where something has shifted permanently. Then it moved, the press beginning to organize its questions, the legal staff beginning to circulate, the family representatives turning to each other with the particular mix of relief and grief and anger that belongs to people who have been waiting for something for a very long time and have now received it, and are discovering that receiving it is more complex than they expected. Afterward was longer than December's afterward. There were more people, more conversations, more things that needed to be said now that the statement had been made. Lyra moved through it all and said what needed saying, and answered what she could answer, and directed to Wren what needed directing. At some point in the middle of the afternoon, Wren found her near the family section and said, quietly, "There's a question you're going to be asked a lot in the next few weeks." She looked at him. "About what comes next," he said. For the surveying work, now that the pattern is in the public record, he paused. There will be pressure to formalize it, to make it an official function, to bring it inside the administrative structure. She had been thinking about this. What's your advice? She said. He considered it. My advice as an administrator is that a formally structured function would be more sustainable and better funded. He paused. My advice as someone who has been watching this work for 10 months is that what makes it work is its independence. The moment it is inside the administrative structure, it has obligations to the administrative structure. She nodded slowly. That's not the answer you're supposed to give, she said. No, he said, but it's the accurate one. She thought about it. Formal partnership, she said. Access to resources and archive credentials without absorption into the structure. The work stays independent. The results are shared with the administration under a clear formal agreement that I control the scope and the pace. Wren looked at her. I'll draft it, he said. You'll consult me at every stage of the drafting, she said. Naturally, he said. She almost smiled. He went back to his own tasks and she went back to hers, and the afternoon moved, and the chamber emptied slowly the way chambers do after things that matter, and eventually there were only the staff and the last of the legal representatives, and the families who had not yet finished the conversations they needed to have. She found Caden near the back of the chamber when most of the formal business was done, talking with Owen Green and Clara and the Harper family's eldest daughter in the easy, attentive way that was simply how he was with people when he was not performing the formal version of himself. She stood nearby, not interrupting, listening to Clara describe the spring planting schedule in the valley and the way the boundary correction had changed the water access for the southern fields. She listened to Owen say that the formal land review for the valley cases was moving more quickly than he had expected, that his contact at the legal office had told him a ruling on the boundary restitution was likely by early summer. She listened to Margaret Harper's granddaughter, a young woman of about 20 who had not been at the December disclosure because she had been in her second year of university, but who had driven down for this one, say with the particular directness of young people who have not yet learned to be indirect about important things. Are you going to keep mapping? After this? The question was addressed to Lyra. She looked at the young woman. She thought about the next set of survey routes, which she had already begun planning in her notebook over the past 2 weeks. She thought about the routes her father had mapped that she had not yet walked, the corridors that were still officially absent from the territorial record, the places where people were living in the gaps between the maps. Yes, she said. The young woman nodded. Something in her expression was settled, the way expressions settle when they receive an answer that removes an uncertainty they did not know they had been carrying. Good, she said. Owen put his hand briefly on Lyra's shoulder and then moved away to collect Clara, and the families began to disperse, and the chamber finished emptying, and eventually there were only 3 people left in it. Wren at the far end still doing what he always did, and Caden and Lyra near the door. Wren, Caden said. 20 minutes, Wren said, without looking up. He means 45, Caden said to Lyra. I know, she said. They went out into the corridor. The building was quieter than it had been. The press had moved to the exterior, where the formal statements were being collected. The staff were in the offices doing the work that followed formal announcements. The families had gone to their cars and their trains and the accommodations they had arranged in the city for the night. The corridor was theirs. She thought about December and the corridor outside the chamber and later as a promise, and the promise kept, and the 10 months that had followed the keeping of it. The formal partnership, she said. Wren and I talked about it. He mentioned it to me last week, Caden said. I didn't want to raise it with you first. I thought it should come from you. It did, she said. Wren's drafting it. Good. He paused. Is that what you want? It's what makes sense, she said. Access without absorption. She looked at him. There's a version of this where the work becomes an official function and I become an official person doing it, and it's more secure and better funded and it loses the thing that makes it work. The independence, he said. The specific freedom, she said. To decide what gets mapped and how and when and why. The moment I have a formal obligation to an administrative structure. Your job changes, he said. Yes, he nodded. He was not arguing with it. She had not expected him to argue with it. She had come to expect that he did not argue with her assessments of her own work, which was one of the things she had verified over 10 months, and which she intended to go on verifying. The partnership structure is right, he said, and Wren will build it correctly. He paused. You'll push back when he gets things wrong. Obviously, she said. He almost smiled. She looked at him in the corridor light, which was the practical flat light of an administrative building that had not been designed with any particular aesthetic in mind, and which was honest in the way of practical things. She thought about a summit hall and a first no and the back of her own head walking away from 200 people while she organized her bag strap. She thought about a courtyard and a wall and dried apricots and a voice saying, "I try to be." She thought about a ridge in the borderlands and a notebook and a lamp that had been fixed without being asked, and 2 hours in a watchtower going through documentation and everything that had followed. She thought about the answer that had not been no for a long time. "Ask me," she said. He looked at her. She had not told him to ask her in the formal bond sense since December. They had not needed to. What had been said in December and in the months after had been clear enough that a formal re-asking had not seemed necessary. But she had been thinking, since the morning she drove back from Ashburn, about what she wanted, and what she wanted was to say yes with the full weight of everything she knew now behind it. She wanted to say it cleanly. She wanted to say it once, clearly, with her eyes open, so that it was in the record the same way the other things were in the record. He understood her. She had known for a long time that he understood her. "Will you stay?" he said. Not a bond question, not a formal question. The question that had been underneath everything since a courtyard in the spring. The real one. The one that was about her specifically. Her direction and her choices and her life as she had built it. She held it for one moment. She thought about her father and the maps and the blank page and the pen. She thought about her mother and the shaking hands and the life that had been made smaller. She thought about herself, the specific self she had spent her whole adult life maintaining. The maps and the notebooks and the unclaimed corridors and the families and the gaps between the official charts. She thought about all of it being still hers, all of it still intact, all of it continuing, and beside it, not instead of it, not organizing itself around it, but genuinely beside it, a person who had asked permission before fixing a lamp. "Yes," she said. It came out simply and without qualification, which was the only way she said things she meant. He looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them said anything else for a moment, because the moment did not require anything else. It required exactly what it had, the one word, plain and complete. In the chamber behind them, they heard Wren's bag clasp close with its decisive click. They heard the sound of his chair being pushed back. They heard his footsteps cross the chamber. The door opened. He looked at them. He looked at them for one moment with the expression of a man who has been waiting for a specific thing for 11 months and has just received confirmation that it has happened, and who is going to be extremely restrained about it. "I'll be in the office tomorrow at 8, he said. 9, Caden said. A pause. 8:30, Wren said. He walked past them and down the corridor and out of the building. She looked after him. "He's going to be extremely smug," she said. "Extremely restrained about it," Caden agreed. She turned back. She looked at the chamber door. She looked at the corridor, and the building, and the capital city outside the windows, where the afternoon was turning toward evening, where the families were finding their accommodations, and the press were filing their reports, and Wren was doing whatever Wren did when he had finished a significant day. She had her notebooks. She had her survey routes for spring. She had the formal partnership framework that Wren was going to draft, and that she was going to revise until it said exactly what it needed to say. She had 3 more unclaimed corridors she had not yet mapped, a regional archive in the West she had not yet touched, a family record collection in the Southern Hills that a woman named Vera Okafor had been keeping for 40 years, and had written to Lyra about 6 months ago asking if anyone was interested. She had the work. She had it all. "Come on," she said. "Let's go home." They walked out of the building and into the February evening, which was cold and clear and smelled of the city at the end of a long day. And they walked through the capital streets toward the flat that was no longer grim, and the notebooks were there, and the lamp was on, and the next set of survey routes were in the planning stage, and the pull in her chest was exactly where it had always been. She was not following it. She was walking with it. She was walking toward the next thing that needed mapping. She walked home. She started the spring survey routes the following week. Not because the capital's work was finished. It was not, and would not be for months, possibly years. The legal reviews were in motion. The land restitution cases were proceeding through the formal channels that Wren managed with his characteristic organized precision, and there were still the Western Regional Archive and the Southern Hills family records and Vera Okafor's collection to get to. But the survey routes were waiting, and she was not someone who let things wait without reason. She told Caden on a Sunday that she was leaving Monday for the Northern Corridor, where she had 3 corrections to verify on foot before she could close the map. He said all right and asked when she would be back, and she said 2 weeks, possibly 3, and he said come back when you're done and meant it. She knew he meant it because he had meant everything he said for 10 months, and she had been paying attention. She drove north on Monday morning in the car she had bought with the first proper payment from the archive review work, which was a modest car and exactly the right car for the roads she drove, and she had her notebooks and her equipment and her drafting kit, and a thermos of tea that she always carried on long drives. She drove through the capital and out the other side, and the city fell away behind her, and the road opened up toward the border country, and she felt, in the specific way that she felt it every time she left on a survey, the particular clarity that came with being in motion toward work. She thought about Wren's draft of the formal partnership agreement, which she had read the previous Friday and marked up with 17 comments, all of them specific and most of them structural, and which Wren had received without complaint and would have revised by the time she returned. She thought about the 3 corrections in the northern corridor, the mountain pass boundary that had been incorrectly marked since the 1940s, the seasonal river junction that shifted in wet years and needed notation for both states, and the access path for the Whitmore family whose land came to the edge of a ridge that wasn't on any current map. She thought about the pull in her chest, which was pointing south toward the capital with its quiet, unremarkable accuracy. She let it point. She drove north. She had said yes to staying, and she meant it. She also meant the Northern Corridor, and the Western Archive, and the survey routes, and Vera Okafor's collection, and the 3 more corridors she had not yet reached, and the next set of notebooks that were going to fill up in the same way the last ones had, with the patient accumulation of evidence about the world as it actually was. She was not choosing between those things. She had stopped believing she had to. The road curved north, and the country opened out, and the sky was the particular wide gray of late February in the border territories. The gray that was not absence of light, but the particular quality of light before spring arrived, when everything was waiting to become itself again. She drove. She thought about a year. She thought about a courtyard and a summit hall and a pull she had felt arriving like a fist in her sternum, and the decision she had made in the same moment, clearly and deliberately, and without apology. She thought about everything that had followed from that decision, not a following of the pull, not a capitulation to the bond, not a narrowing of herself toward someone else's gravity, but the long, careful, evidence-based process of discovering what was actually there, which was what she always did, which was the only method she trusted. She had mapped it. She knew its shape. She knew the shape of him, the care that showed up in small, precise ways, the honesty that did not flinch, the patience that was not strategy, the capacity to carry a history about himself without looking away from it. She knew the shape of what she had decided, not to follow a hook but to choose a direction, which were different things in the way that mattered. She knew her own shape, which had not changed. She had 3 notebooks that were almost full. She had the new ones in the passenger seat, blank, waiting. She had work. She drove north through the wide gray morning, and the road was clean and empty, and the border country was coming up ahead of her with its particular quality of being itself, regardless of what anyone had decided about it on a map. She was going to correct the maps. She always corrected the maps. She turned up the heat in the car and drank the last of her tea from the thermos and watched the road ahead and felt the pull in her chest pointing back toward the capital, where Wren was revising the agreement and Caden was doing whatever Caden did on a Monday morning when she was not there. She let it point. She drove. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. The road went north and the sky was wide and the work was waiting and she was going toward it, and behind her the capital held what it held, and ahead of her the corridor held what it held, and none of it required her to be smaller than she was. She drove. She had always been good at this. She was going to keep doing it. That was the whole story, and it was simple, and it was hers.